had always thought I knew what I was doing when it came to being out in the wild. Hiking, camping, and living off the land wasn't anything new to me. I grew up with it, spending weekends and summers with my family in the woods, sitting around the campfire, fishing by the lake, and trekking through the mountains were the highlights of my childhood. So when I decided to spend a few days at a remote cabin deep in the woods, I figured it would be just another adventure to add to the long list of experiences I'd already had. I'd chosen this particular cabin because it was secluded, far away from any human settlement. The weather was turning crisp, autumn was setting in, and the air was full of the scent of pine and the faint promise of snow. The place was the kind of spot that was perfect for getting away from everything. No cell service, no distractions. Just me, the forest, and a lot of time to reflect. I wasn't really expecting anything out of the ordinary. I had everything I needed: food, a couple of books, firewood, and a backpack full of supplies. The cabin itself was simple, just a wooden structure with a tin roof, a fireplace, and a small loft where the bed was. The walls were lined with old photos of the place, and the windows gave you a view straight out into the thick forest. A perfect spot to just sit, relax, and clear my head. The first night was calm. I spent it reading by the fire, listening to the crackle of the logs and the occasional noise from the woods, twigs snapping under the weight of some unseen animal. The air was cool, but inside the cabin, it was warm, and the smell of wood smoke made it feel cozy. I cooked myself a simple meal, then went to bed, the exhaustion of the hike earlier in the day finally catching up with me. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and I slept soundly. It wasn't until the second night that things started to get unsettling. I'd been outside most of the day, taking in the fresh air, walking through the woods, and enjoying the solitude. It was peaceful, and I had no reason to believe anything was amiss. But as dusk approached, something in the air shifted. The wind picked up slightly, causing the trees to rustle in a way that made the sounds of the forest seem more alive than usual. The kind of alive that made you feel like you were being watched. I brushed it off. Maybe it was just the change in weather. I was inside the cabin again by the time night fully settled in. The fire was low, and I was about to go to bed when I heard something. A knock at the door. It wasn't a loud knock, but it was distinct enough to make me freeze. I stood there for a moment, waiting to hear it again, but nothing came. No voices, no footsteps. I slowly made my way to the door, my mind racing. I wasn't expecting anyone. The nearest neighbors were miles away, and I hadn't seen a soul since I arrived. I opened the door slowly, half expecting someone to be standing there, but no one was. There was nothing but the cold, empty darkness of the forest. I stepped out onto the porch, looking around, but saw nothing. No one was in sight. The wind had died down, and the woods were eerily quiet again. Shaking my head, I closed the door and locked it. I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe just an animal brushing against the door, or the wind making something fall outside. But the feeling of unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I hardly slept. Every time I heard a noise, I would jerk awake, listening intently. It was hard to ignore the creeping suspicion that I wasn't alone, that something was moving around the cabin. But when I checked the windows, the dark forest beyond seemed as still and empty as it always had. The next morning, I decided to head out for a hike, trying to shake off the discomfort. I spent the day out in the woods again, walking farther than I had the previous day. The trees were beginning to shed their leaves, the ground blanketed with a carpet of golden and amber hues. It was beautiful, but something felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there, but I pushed the thought aside. I kept reminding myself that I'd spent so much time out here, in the wild, that this feeling was probably just a trick of my mind. It wasn't until the third night that things took a more alarming turn. I had just finished making dinner, a simple stew that I had been heating up over the fire, when I heard it again. A knock, this time louder, more forceful. It was coming from the back door. I was instantly on edge, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced. Who would be out here? What did they want? I had been so careful not to advertise my presence. and the idea of someone knowing I was out here made my stomach churn. I didn't go to the door immediately. Instead, I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and crept to the back window, shining it out into the darkness. But there was nothing, no movement, no sign of life. It was almost as if whatever had knocked was simply waiting, watching. I spent the rest of the evening sitting by the fire, trying to calm myself down. But sleep didn't come easy. I was hyper-aware of every creak in the cabin, every rustle outside. Every time I heard something, I jumped. It wasn't the animals of the forest that unnerved me. It was the feeling that someone was out there, that I wasn't as alone as I thought. Around midnight, I finally decided I had enough. I wasn't going to sit around any longer, letting my mind spiral out of control. I grabbed my backpack, my jacket, and the flashlight, and I went outside to check the area. I circled the cabin, looking for any sign of what might be going on. My breath came out in clouds in the cold air, and the light from the flashlight barely pierced the thick darkness of the trees. Every time I turned around, I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was following me, just out of sight. But there was nothing, no tracks, no disturbances in the earth. The forest was just the forest, still and quiet, as it had been when I first arrived. As I stood there, trying to make sense of everything, I noticed something odd. A small pile of twigs and branches near the side of the cabin. It was recent, too recent. I knew for a fact I hadn't seen it before, and it didn't look like something an animal would do. It was carefully arranged, almost deliberately. I froze. The feeling of being watched returned with a vengeance. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to grab my things and just run. But I couldn't. I stood there for a few moments, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But the longer I stared at the pile of twigs, the more I felt the undeniable truth, that something was not right here. I spent the next few hours pacing inside the cabin, locking the doors, checking the windows. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming for me, that I wasn't safe anymore. I debated calling for help, but the cabin had no phone signal, and the nearest town was miles away. I had no way of reaching anyone. The isolation was supposed to be a comfort, but now it felt like a trap. By morning, I knew I had to leave. Whatever had been happening, I didn't want to be around for it anymore. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, trying to remain calm, but my hands were shaking as I stuffed my belongings into my bag. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I wasn't going to stay another night. I left the cabin behind, walking down the narrow trail that led me back to the main road. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. But when I reached the road, I turned back one last time to look at the cabin. It was just a small structure, surrounded by the dense forest, quiet and still. Nothing seemed out of place. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far worse. When I finally made it back to town, I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what had happened. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew that whatever had been lurking in those woods, whatever had been knocking at my door, was something I would never understand. And I was glad to be rid of it. The cabin was abandoned after that. No one else ever stayed there. At least no one I knew. I don't go back to that part of the woods anymore. It's better that way. It was the kind of trip I thought would be simple, something to clear my head. A few days in the woods, away from the noise and the stress of city life. The cabin I'd rented was remote, completely off the grid. I'd heard about it from a friend who said it was a perfect getaway for someone who needed to disconnect. He wasn't wrong. The place was everything I needed, or so I thought. It was the middle of October, the air crisp, the trees beginning to lose their leaves. A sharp wind whipped through the forest as I pulled up to the cabin, the gravel crunching beneath the tires of my old truck. I'd been driving for hours, the last stretch of road dirt and barely visible. The kind of place you wouldn't come across unless you were specifically looking for it. The cabin itself was small, nestled against a backdrop of dense woods, far enough away from any sign of civilization to feel entirely alone. There were no neighbors, no cars passing by, just trees, dirt roads, and the occasional animal track. The moment I stepped out of the truck, I felt a weight settle over me, a silence unlike any other. It wasn't peaceful, like you'd imagine. It felt heavy, almost suffocating, but I brushed it off, thinking it was just the isolation. I was here to relax, after all, not to overthink every little thing. The front porch creaked as I stepped onto it, the old wood groaning under my weight. I unlocked the door, the key hanging from the hook just inside. Inside, the cabin was rustic, yet cozy. A simple layout, a small living room with a wood-burning stove, a tiny kitchen, and a staircase leading up to a loft where I'd be sleeping. The decor was sparse, nothing more than the bare essentials. A few chairs, a table, some shelves with a mix of old books and trinkets. I unpacked my things, set up my spot in the loft, and decided to take a walk around the area. The weather had turned colder, with the wind biting at my skin as I trudged through the underbrush, the leaves crunching beneath my boots. There were no trails here, at least not ones that were marked. It felt like the kind of place where you could get lost, but I wasn't worried. I had a map and a good sense of direction. After walking for about an hour, I turned back toward the cabin. It felt good to be away from everything, even if the silence still gnawed at the edges of my mind. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I started a fire in the stove, settling in with a book I'd brought. As night fell, the darkness outside seemed to press in closer. The cabin was small enough that I felt almost too enclosed, but it was warm and I soon grew comfortable. The crackling of the fire, the sound of the wind outside, everything felt manageable. That night, I woke up to a sound, a tapping, soft, almost like a twig hitting the window. I was groggy at first, half dreaming, but the sound continued. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up, my heart racing a little. The window beside the bed was dark, reflecting the outline of the trees outside. I couldn't see anything, but the sound was clear. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, trying not to make any noise, and quietly crept toward the window. I pulled back the curtain, and for a second, I thought I saw movement, a shadow darting between the trees. My heart skipped a beat. Was it an animal? Person? The logical part of me told myself it was probably just a branch or some debris in the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I backed away from the window and sat down on the edge of the bed, listening. The tapping had stopped, but now there was another noise, a soft rustling, almost like footsteps on the leaves outside. I held my breath, my body tensed. I should have grabbed my phone. I should have checked the locks on the doors, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed frozen, listening to the sounds of the forest, trying to make sense of the chaos in my mind. After what felt like an eternity, the noise faded. It was eerily quiet again, the kind of silence that's worse than any sound. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the wind, but sleep didn't come easily after that. I kept listening for any sound, every creak of the floorboards, every shift in the air outside, but nothing came. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke up with a headache, the remnants of the fear from the night before still hanging in the back of my mind. The wind had died down, and sunlight streamed through the cracks in the cabin walls. The world outside felt calm, as though nothing had happened. I decided to head into town to grab some supplies. The nearest store was about a 30-minute drive, but the road was smooth and easy enough. On my way there, I tried to shake the feeling of unease, but it lingered. I kept thinking about the tapping, the rustling. It felt like something had been watching me, waiting for me to slip up. By the time I reached the store, the day had warmed up, and I felt a little better. I stocked up on food, snacks, and firewood. As I checked out, the clerk, a middle-aged woman with a bored expression, gave me a quick once-over. "You staying at that cabin on Willow Ridge?" she asked as she scanned my items. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. "Why?" She paused, looking at me with an unreadable expression. "You'll be fine, just don't go wandering too far off the road. It's easy to get lost out there. People around here don't really go up there much anymore." Her tone was strange, but I didn't ask her to elaborate. I just smiled, grabbed my bags, and left. As I drove back to the cabin, I tried to ignore the nagging feeling that I was being too cautious. Maybe the isolation had gotten to me, or maybe I was just overthinking it all. That night, I made sure to lock up every door and window. I built another fire, hoping the warmth would settle my nerves. I ate some dinner and tried to relax, but the feeling that something was off persisted. The wind kicked up again, howling through the trees outside, but it wasn't as comforting as it had been the first night. Instead, it felt like a warning. I slept with one eye open that night. The same tapping returned, and this time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly crept to the window. I shone the light out into the dark forest, but saw nothing. No shadows, no movement. I kept the flashlight on for a while, scanning the area. Nothing, but the tapping didn't stop. Tap, tap, tap. It was then that I realized the tapping wasn't coming from the window at all. It was coming from the door. I froze, my mind racing. It was too quiet outside, too still. Why hadn't I heard footsteps? Why was it just tapping? I stood still for a long moment, unsure of what to do. I wanted to check the door, to make sure it was locked, but the thought of going anywhere near it felt wrong. I couldn't shake the sense that whatever was out there was waiting for me to make a move. The tapping continued. Tap, tap, tap. Finally, I gathered my courage and moved toward the door. Slowly, quietly, I turned the handle. The door didn't budge at first, and I breathed a sigh of relief. But then it creaked open just a little, as though something on the other side was pushing it. I stepped back, the fear rising in my chest. My mind raced with all sorts of scenarios. Could have been an animal, maybe a deer or something larger, like a bear. But why was it tapping? And why had it waited so long before making a sound? I backed away from the door, heart pounding. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a human voice. A soft, rasping whisper. It wasn't words, just a sound, like someone was trying to speak but couldn't quite form the words. It came from outside, just beyond the door. My instincts told me to run, to get out of there, but I was paralyzed, frozen in place. The whisper grew louder, almost like it was calling me, beckoning me to open the door. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The tapping, the whispering, the wind, silence. I didn't wait another second. I bolted upstairs and locked myself in the loft. The whole cabin seemed to close in on me. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. I just waited, listening for any sign that the night was over. In the morning, the sunlight felt like a cruel joke. Everything outside was still. The wind was calm. No sign of anything unusual. I gathered my things and left the cabin early, driving as fast as I could until I hit the nearest town. I never went back to that cabin. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to take a break from the constant buzz of city life. The idea was simple: rent a cabin in the woods, away from everything, for a few days. It seemed like the perfect escape. No phone service, no distractions, just me and nature. I rented the cabin from a small, family-owned business in a town about 3 hours north of where I lived. The owner, an old man named Hank, told me the cabin was secluded and offered peace and quiet like I'd never experienced. He gave me a key, a brief rundown of the place, and wished me well. The cabin itself was located on the edge of a dense forest, a few miles outside the nearest town. I could see the outline of the mountain range in the distance, and I had to drive a winding dirt road to get there. The road was narrow and bumpy, and after a while, I started to feel like I was heading further and further away from civilization. There were no other cars on the road, and the silence, other than the sound of my engine and the occasional bird, was unsettling. As I approached the cabin, the trees thickened, and the sunlight seemed to fade a little. The air felt cool and fresh, the kind of air you could actually breathe in deeply without feeling suffocated by smog. When I finally reached the cabin, I parked the car and stood there for a moment, just taking in the view. The cabin was small but sturdy, a log structure with a stone chimney. The porch was lined with a couple of old wooden chairs, and the windows were covered with weathered shutters. It didn't look like much, but it had a certain charm. It was peaceful, tucked away from everything. I grabbed my bags, went inside, and began to unpack. Inside, the cabin was just as simple as it looked from the outside. The floor was covered in rough wooden planks. The walls were made of logs that looked like they had been around for decades, and there was a stone fireplace against one wall. The kitchen was basic, with an old stove, a small refrigerator, and a sink with a few mismatched cups and plates. The bathroom was tiny, and the only source of light in the whole place was a few dim lamps scattered around. It wasn't luxurious by any means, but it was comfortable in a rustic way. I was alone, with nothing but the sound of the wind outside and the occasional chirp of a bird. It was perfect. I spent the first evening getting settled, lighting a fire in the fireplace, and making a simple dinner. The air outside had grown chilly, and the trees swayed in the wind. I could hear the leaves rustling, and I felt the kind of calm that only comes from being completely alone in nature. There was no rush, no expectations, just me and the quiet. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard strange sounds outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it sounded like something large moving around outside, just beyond the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the noise didn't sound quite right. It was slow, deliberate, like something was circling the cabin. I held my breath, listening, my mind racing. The noise stopped after a while, and I told myself it was nothing. But then I heard it again. This time, it was louder, and it sounded like something was scraping against the side of the cabin, just beneath the window. My heart skipped a beat, and I sat up in bed, the sheets tangling around my legs. I grabbed the flashlight beside me and pointed it toward the window, my hand trembling. I didn't see anything, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I sat there for a while, the light flickering in my hands, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. I eventually convinced myself to go back to sleep, but the feeling lingered, like something was out there, just waiting. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun was still low, and the air had a crisp, clean smell to it. I decided to take a walk around the property to clear my head. The cabin was situated on a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. A creek ran through the property, and I could hear the sound of running water as I walked. The forest was dense, and it was easy to get lost in it. The birds were chirping, and the only other sound was the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. As I walked toward the creek, I noticed something strange. Broken branches. Not just a few here and there, but a series of broken branches, as if something large had been pushing through the woods. I felt uneasy again. I had no idea what it could have been, but it didn't feel natural. The trail led me down to the creek, and I stood there for a while, just watching the water flow. It was beautiful, peaceful even, but the thought of those broken branches kept nagging at me. I decided to head back to the cabin, but as I made my way back up the hill, I noticed something odd. A set of footprints in the mud. They were large, too large to be from an animal, and they were fresh. My pulse quickened, and a wave of unease washed over me. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that it was just some hiker or someone else who had been here before me, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I made my way back to the cabin, and for the rest of the day, I tried to shake the feeling of being watched. I stayed inside most of the time, keeping the windows shut and the doors locked. As the sun began to set, the temperature dropped, and the wind picked up. I made dinner and sat in front of the fire, trying to distract myself from the unease that seemed to grow with each passing hour. That night, the noises came again. The scraping sound against the cabin's walls, the slow, deliberate movements outside. My heart was racing, and this time I didn't dare go to the window. I stayed in the dark, listening. The sound was closer now, and I could hear the faintest rustling near the porch. I didn't know what it was, but I was certain it wasn't an animal. I tried to keep calm, telling myself that I just needed to get through the night, but the sounds kept coming. Scraping, shuffling, a loud thump against the wall. I could feel the fear creeping up my spine. My mind raced, imagining the worst. What if someone was out there? What if they were trying to break in? I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy cast iron skillet from the kitchen. It wasn't much, but it felt like something. I pressed myself against the wall, listening intently, the silence thick around me. For what felt like hours, I waited. The sounds came and went, but the feeling of being watched never left. Eventually, the noises stopped, but I didn't dare sleep. I stayed up all night, listening to every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind. At some point, the adrenaline wore off and I dozed off in the early morning hours, exhausted. When I woke up the next morning, it was eerily quiet. The birds weren't singing, and the wind had died down. I ventured outside to inspect the cabin, looking for any signs of damage. The footprints from the previous day were still there, leading up to the porch. But what caught my attention was the door. The lock had been tampered with just slightly. It wasn't enough to force the door open, but someone had definitely been trying. I spent the rest of the day packing up my things. I didn't care how much time I had left on the rental. I wasn't staying another night. I locked the cabin behind me and drove back down the winding dirt road, not once looking back. It wasn't until I got back to the town that I saw the police car parked outside the general store. As I pulled into the gas station, I overheard a conversation between the officer and a woman. She was frantic, asking if anyone had heard from a hiker who had gone missing a few days ago. The officer said they were still looking for him, but there was no sign. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized that the footprints I had seen in the woods might not have been mine. I never went back to that cabin, and every time I hear a branch crack in the woods, I can't help but wonder who or what was really out there. It was the summer of 2016 when I decided to take a solo trip into the mountains. After a rough couple of months dealing with work stress and personal issues, I figured some time away from everything would be just what I needed. No phones, no distractions, just the quiet of nature and the sound of my own thoughts. I rented a small cabin through a website that promised a peaceful getaway, far from the nearest town. The description said it was tucked deep into the forest, a place for those who wanted solitude and to escape the noise of the world. I was 28 at the time, and although I wasn't an experienced hiker, I considered myself fairly outdoorsy. I'd gone on camping trips and short hikes before, and I had some basic survival knowledge, enough to get by at least. But nothing could have prepared me for what I would face that week. The cabin was located in the foothills of the Cascade Range, about 2 hours outside of Spokane, Washington. I drove there on a Thursday morning, making my way through winding roads that led deeper into the forest. The further I went, the fewer signs of civilization I saw. The forest grew denser, and the road became less maintained. At one point, the GPS lost signal completely, and I relied on handwritten directions from the rental listing. By the time I arrived at the cabin, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. It was a small, weathered structure, sitting on a plot of land surrounded by tall pines. The cabin itself was rustic but cozy looking, with a stone chimney and a porch that wrapped around one side. There was a small fire pit in the yard, and a narrow dirt trail led off into the woods behind the cabin. I unloaded my gear, making sure to double-check everything: tent, sleeping bag, food, water. The cabin was fully stocked with basic supplies, and there was a wood-burning stove inside for heat. I wasn't planning on staying inside much, but I thought I should at least get familiar with the place before heading out for a hike. As I entered the cabin, I noticed how quiet it was. There were no sounds, no cars, no birds chirping. It was as if the world had been muffled. The interior was simple, with wooden floors and walls. A few mismatched chairs sat around a small table, and the kitchen was equipped with just enough for cooking basic meals. It wasn't luxurious, but it was charming in its own way. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple dinner, read a book for a while, and then went to bed early. The isolation didn't bother me. In fact, I welcomed the silence. I slept soundly, the occasional creaking of the cabin settling keeping me company through the night. But the next morning, things began to feel a little off. It was subtle at first. I woke up to the sound of something scratching at the door. At first, I thought it was just a raccoon or a squirrel, maybe a stray dog. I didn't think much of it, assuming it was an animal trying to get at some food. I ignored it, figuring it would go away, but the scratching continued for a good while, almost as if it were deliberate. I got up to look through the small window beside the door, but I didn't see anything. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The cabin felt eerily still, too still. I brushed it off and made myself breakfast. The day was clear and warm, and I decided to head out for a hike. There was a trail that began right behind the cabin, winding through the forest and eventually leading up to a ridge that overlooked a valley. The rental listing had promised breathtaking views, and I was eager to see for myself. I grabbed my gear, making sure I had enough water and snacks, and set off into the woods. The trail was narrow at first, flanked by dense underbrush and towering trees. The ground was soft underfoot, and the air was thick with the smell of pine. It felt like I was walking through an untouched wilderness, far from any sign of human activity. For the first couple of hours, the hike was peaceful. I didn't encounter another soul, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. I took in the beauty of the landscape, the moss-covered rocks, the trickling streams, the sunlight filtering through the canopy above. But then, something strange happened. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I noticed a small clearing ahead. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a broken-down structure, what looked like an old, abandoned shack. It wasn't on any of the maps I had seen, and it seemed out of place in the middle of the forest. The wood was weathered and rotting, the roof sagging in on itself. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped closer. The door hung loosely on its hinges, and the windows were covered with grime and cobwebs. I peered inside but saw nothing but dust and debris. It didn't seem like there was anything of value there, but something about the place sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I snapped a few pictures with my phone and then quickly left, deciding it was time to head back to the cabin. The air felt heavier now, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder as I walked away from the shack. I told myself it was nothing, just an old, abandoned building that had no business being there. But the unease lingered. When I got back to the cabin, I was ready to relax and unwind. I made dinner, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was subtle, just a nagging sensation in the back of my mind. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and sat by the fire. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees outside. The shadows in the cabin seemed deeper now, as if the night had grown colder. That night, I slept fitfully. The strange scratching at the door returned, louder this time. It was rhythmic, like someone or something was dragging something along the wood. I lay still, listening, stopped after a while, but I couldn't shake the sense that there was something wrong. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed my things quickly, wanting to get out of that cabin. I didn't feel safe there anymore. The scratching, the shack, the unease, it was all too much. But as I stepped outside, I froze. There, in the dirt near the porch, were fresh footprints. Large, heavy prints, too large to be from any animal I knew. They were human, but they were odd. The toes were misshapen, the prints deep in the earth, like whoever had made them was dragging something heavy. I froze in place, heart pounding. My first instinct was to get in my car and leave, but then I noticed something else. On the porch, just next to the door, was a small bundle of sticks arranged in a strange pattern, as if someone had left it there deliberately. I backed away slowly, then turned and ran for my car. My breath came in ragged gasps as I started the engine, looking in the rearview mirror. The cabin, the trail, the strange marks, everything felt wrong. I didn't look back. As I drove away, I felt a weight lift from my chest. But even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there in the woods is still watching, still waiting for the next person to wander too close. I had always been someone who craved solitude. I wasn't the type of person who enjoyed crowds or noise. So when I found out about a small, remote cabin tucked away in the woods, far from any civilization, I jumped at the chance to rent it. It wasn't even that expensive, just a little rustic spot where I could spend some time alone and unwind. I didn't tell anyone, just packed my bags, grabbed a few essentials, and headed out. The idea of being disconnected for a while, without phone service, without anyone around to distract me, seemed perfect. The cabin was located in the dense woods of northern Montana, about 5 miles from the nearest town. The area was known for its rugged terrain and the vast, quiet stretches of forest that surrounded it. The whole place had a history of being somewhat isolated, used mostly by hunters during the colder months and by hikers during the summer. But it had been some time since anyone had stayed there, and when I arrived, I could tell by the weathered wood and the overgrown path that it had been a while. I parked my car in the small clearing just outside the cabin and unpacked my things. The first thing that struck me as I stood in front of the cabin was how quiet it was. The wind barely rustled the trees. It felt as if nature had decided to hold its breath, waiting. The air was crisp, and there was a faint smell of pine and earth. It felt peaceful, though I couldn't shake the sense of something ancient about the woods surrounding me. I shrugged it off. People had been living here for centuries, right? Nothing to fear. Inside the cabin, things were exactly as I expected. The wooden floors creaked under my weight, and dust swirled in the dim light that filtered through the cracks in the walls. The furniture was simple. A worn couch, an old coffee table, a small kitchen area with just the basics. There was a fireplace at the far end of the room, the hearth lined with soot, and a couple of lamps that ran on oil. A small window by the door looked out onto the thick forest that surrounded the cabin, and in the opposite corner was a narrow staircase that led up to the loft. I spent the first few hours just settling in, unpacking my things, and exploring the immediate surroundings. The cabin itself sat on a slight hill, surrounded by towering pine trees that reached toward the sky. A small creek trickled through the woods not too far off, but other than that, the area felt incredibly still. It was exactly what I wanted. I made some food, set up a fire in the fireplace, and spent the night reading. The wood crackled as the fire burned, and the wind howled outside. It was peaceful, almost to the point of being eerie, but nothing out of the ordinary. The first few days passed in a blur of peace. I woke up early, went on long hikes through the woods, and explored the nearby creek. The silence of the forest was thick, and the only sounds I heard were the occasional bird calls or the rustle of leaves underfoot. There were no signs of life other than the occasional squirrel or bird. Even the air seemed to stand still, like the world was holding its breath. The cabin became my refuge, a quiet little sanctuary where I could think, read, and get away from the pressures of the outside world. On the fourth night, however, things started to feel off. It was subtle at first. I had just finished my dinner and was lounging on the couch, staring into the fire. The night was clear, the moonlight streaming through the cracks in the cabin, casting long shadows on the wooden floor. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. That's when I first heard it, the faint sound from outside. It was difficult to identify at first, just a low rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. At first, I assumed it was just an animal, a deer or perhaps a bear. But there was something strange about the sound. It was deliberate, slow, as if someone or something was intentionally trying to be quiet. I froze, listening intently, my heart beating a little faster. The sound came again, this time louder, closer. It wasn't just an animal. It was something else, something that didn't belong. I stood up, walked to the window, and peered out into the darkness. All I could see was the black expanse of trees, their branches swaying gently in the wind. No movement, no shape, just the blackness of the night. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. I was tired. I had been out in the woods all day, and the isolation was starting to get to me. I tried to shake off the feeling and went back to the couch, but the unease lingered. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found it hard to relax. I kept hearing the rustling, now coming from the other side of the cabin, and then the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. My thoughts raced. What could it be? Another person? An animal? I had to check. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and slipped on my boots, stepping cautiously outside. The cold air bit at my skin as I walked down the small porch and into the yard. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, but all I saw were trees, their branches swaying, their shadows stretching across the ground. I stood there for a moment, straining my ears, but the rustling had stopped. I scanned the woods around me, but there was nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual quiet, the occasional rustle of the leaves in the breeze. I let out a sigh of relief. It must have been an animal, maybe a deer or something moving through the brush. I turned to go back inside, but just as I stepped back toward the cabin, I heard something, a faint scraping sound, like something moving against the side of the building. I froze, the flashlight shaking in my hand. My heart skipped a beat. The sound was too deliberate, too precise to be an animal. It was something else. Something or someone was out there. I rushed inside and locked the door behind me. My mind was racing. I hadn't seen anything. There was no sign of any person or animal, but that scraping sound, it was still fresh in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I sat down by the fire, my hands trembling slightly. The night dragged on, and the silence grew deeper, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. The next day, I decided to stay close to the cabin, just to be cautious. I made breakfast, washed up, and kept the windows shut. The wind had picked up, and the air felt even colder than before. It wasn't just the temperature that made me uneasy, though. It was the sensation of being alone, really alone. There was something unsettling about being in such an isolated place, surrounded by so much wilderness. No one could hear me if something went wrong. I spent most of the day inside, reading and trying to distract myself. But every now and then, I would hear a faint noise from outside, something just at the edge of my hearing. It was too quiet, too isolated for there to be anything normal. It wasn't the sound of wind or animals. It was something else. It wasn't until that evening that I began to understand what was happening. I had gone to bed early that night, hoping the rest would calm my nerves. The wind howled outside, but I was so tired that I fell asleep quickly. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of something moving around outside the cabin. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the animals. It was footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone was pacing just outside the door. I lay there, motionless, my heart pounding. The footsteps came closer, circling around the cabin. Whoever or whatever it was, it knew I was inside. I could hear it moving around the back, along the side. It was clear that it was waiting for something, watching. I waited for what felt like hours, but the footsteps never stopped. Eventually, they faded into the distance, but I didn't move from my spot. Couldn't. I just stayed there, my mind racing, thinking about what I should do next. The next morning, I packed up my things and left. I didn't bother to finish the trip or to explore the woods any longer. Something in me told me that the woods didn't want me there anymore, that whatever had been out there wasn't just a random animal or a figment of my imagination. I never went back. The cabin is still there, empty, but I know now that some places are better left undisturbed. The drive had been long, the kind of journey where the hours seemed to drag by, each mile pulling you further away from everything familiar, and yet closer to something that feels like a refuge. The type of road that turns from asphalt to gravel, and the trees start to thicken, the shadows stretching longer as you head deeper into the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. I hadn't been to this cabin in years. I had forgotten just how isolated it was, even though I had spent many summers here with my family as a child. I was 32 now, and a lot had changed. The cabin was no longer a place of safety or adventure. Now, it felt more like a tomb, abandoned to the elements and forgotten by time. But I needed this. The pressure of work, the noise of the city, the constant hum of technology. It had all been too much. I just needed to get away, to clear my mind, and this place was the only option left. So I rented the cabin for the weekend. The wooden structure was small but sturdy, built in the 80s by my grandfather. The roof was slanted, the paint chipped, and the windows foggy with age. There was no running water, no electricity, nothing but a small propane stove and a wood-burning stove that seemed to warm the cabin only when it felt like it. But that didn't matter. The air was fresh, and there was no one for miles. Just me, the wilderness, and my thoughts. I pulled up to the front of the cabin, my tires crunching on the gravel driveway as I parked. The trees surrounding the area were thick and untamed, a stark contrast to the neatly kept lawns of my city apartment. I grabbed my bags from the back seat and made my way to the front door, the smell of pine and earth filling the air. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the quiet forest around me. The interior was just as I remembered. The wooden beams in the ceiling, the old fireplace in the corner, the faded couch that had seen better days. I set my bags down by the door, took a deep breath, and went to start a fire in the stove. The crackle of the flames as they caught was comforting, and I felt a small sense of peace as I sat down in the worn armchair by the fire. That night, after eating a quick dinner of canned soup and bread, I sat outside, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. The sky was clear, the stars sharp and bright, and the air was so cold it burned in my lungs. It felt like the world had been shut out, leaving only me and the wilderness behind. But as the night wore on, I noticed something strange. It started with a rustling sound coming from the trees. At first, I thought it was just a deer or some other animal, but then I heard it again. It was almost too deliberate. Not the random noises of the forest, but something that sounded methodical, like footsteps, slow and cautious. I stood up, my breath visible in the chilly air. I glanced around, trying to see through the darkness. There was nothing. The forest was quiet again. Maybe it was just my imagination, I thought. The isolation was getting to me. I went back inside, locked the door, and settled in for the night. I kept the fire burning, the flames dancing and crackling as the wind howled outside. But sleep didn't come easily. The sound of footsteps lingered in my mind. The wind seemed to carry a whisper, a murmur that I couldn't quite make out. Hours passed. I checked the windows once or twice, convinced I saw movement in the trees just beyond the cabin's glow. But there was nothing there. No one. No sign of life except the forest itself. By morning, I had convinced myself that it had been nothing more than the wind playing tricks on me. After all, this cabin was isolated. It wasn't unusual for animals to wander near the property, and it was possible that the wind had carried the sound in strange ways. But I still couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next day, I decided to go for a hike. I wasn't sure where I was going, just somewhere to clear my head. I grabbed my jacket, a small pack with water and snacks, and headed into the forest. The trail was old, overgrown with ferns and thick brush, but it was still passable. I remembered it from when I was younger. My family used to hike these trails all the time. I followed the trail for a while, the woods around me becoming denser. The trees seemed to close in on me, casting long, stretching shadows that made the forest feel even more claustrophobic. The air was heavy, thick with moisture, and the smell of wet earth and pine needles filled my nose. As I hiked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, the feeling of being watched creeping up on me again. The wind was still, and the sounds of the forest seemed muffled, as if something was preventing the usual chatter of birds and insects. After an hour or so, I reached a clearing. The view was breathtaking, a sheer drop to the valley below, the mountains rising high in the distance. I stood there for a moment, taking in the beauty of it all, trying to quiet the nagging feeling in my chest. But then I heard it again, the rustling. It was close this time. I turned quickly, but there was nothing. The trees swayed gently, but I didn't see any animals. No movement, nothing but the echo of my own heartbeat in my ears. I tried to convince myself it was just my nerves playing tricks again, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I retraced my steps, walking briskly now, my eyes scanning the trees. The sound of footsteps followed me, slow and deliberate. I could hear them now clearly. Someone or something was following me. Panic set in, quickened my pace, breaking into a jog. My breath came faster, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't alone. I knew it now, but who could be out here? The nearest neighbor was miles away. There was no one else around for miles, and yet, the footsteps grew louder, closer. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning as I sprinted back toward the cabin. The path seemed endless, the trees pressing in on me like they were closing off my escape. Every snap of a twig underfoot made me jump. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do. Should I lock myself in the cabin? Should I confront whoever was out here? By the time I reached the cabin, my chest was heaving, and my legs felt like they were going to give out. I slammed the door shut behind me, bolting it and locking the windows. I was panting, my mind in a frenzy, but the silence around me felt almost deafening. I spent the next few hours pacing around the cabin, too anxious to sit still. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made my heart race. The footsteps had stopped, but the feeling of being watched lingered. It was as if someone, or something, was waiting just outside. As night fell, I tried to keep the fire going, but my eyes kept darting to the windows, expecting to see movement in the shadows. The night felt like it lasted forever, the darkness pressing in, suffocating me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave. There was something out there, and I wasn't about to wait around to find out what it was. I grabbed my bag and opened the front door, stepping outside cautiously. The wind had picked up again, and the trees swayed ominously. The night was cold, the moon barely visible through the thick clouds. My breath formed small clouds in the air as I stood, scanning the darkness. The rustling was gone, but the feeling of unease remained. I decided to leave, to head back to the nearest town. I didn't care how far it was anymore. I just needed to get away. As I made my way back to my truck, the footsteps didn't follow me. There was no sign of anyone, and yet I still felt their presence, lurking just out of sight. When I reached the truck, I started the engine and drove away, the gravel road disappearing behind me. As the cabin grew smaller in my rearview mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. But I didn't stop, not until I was miles away from that place. I never returned to that cabin. It was as though the wilderness itself was trying to keep me there, keep me trapped in its endless maze. But I made it out, and as I drove into the city, I knew one thing for sure. Sometimes it's better to leave some things in the past where they belong. I had always loved the idea of escaping the hustle and bustle of city life. The constant noise, the crowded streets, the overwhelming pressure. Everything about it felt suffocating. So, when I had the chance to rent a small cabin tucked away in the mountains for a weekend, I jumped at it. The place was secluded, far enough from civilization to provide the kind of solitude I craved. A break, peace and quiet. It was late September, and the air had just started to turn crisp. The colors of fall were beginning to settle in. The leaves were turning vibrant shades of orange, red, and yellow, and the scent of damp earth and pine needles filled the air. The cabin was old but charming. It was small, with a stone fireplace, a couple of worn wooden chairs, and a large window that framed a stunning view of the valley below. From the outside, it looked like a place frozen in time, tucked away in a corner of the world that had no real connection to the busy modern age. I had driven up alone, taking my time on the winding mountain roads. It was an hour's drive from the nearest town, and I felt the weight of the isolation settling in as I ascended higher into the mountains. The further I got from the city, the quieter it became. The roads narrowed, and the trees seemed to grow closer, their thick trunks blocking out the sun. The sound of my tires on the gravel road was the only thing breaking the stillness. When I finally reached the cabin, I felt a sense of relief. There was something comforting about being so far removed from everything. No texts, no emails, no distractions. Just me and the wilderness. I unloaded my things from the car and stepped into the cabin, the wooden floor creaking under my feet. The air inside smelled of dust and old wood, and the fireplace was cold, though there were signs of previous fires. I spent the first few hours settling in, exploring the cabin and its surroundings. It was a simple place with a single bedroom, a bathroom with a clawfoot tub, and a small kitchen. The furniture was basic but sturdy, with an old wooden table in the corner and a few chairs that had clearly been there for years. I stoked the fireplace, feeling the warmth slowly begin to spread through the room, and sat down with a book. As the sun began to set, the sky outside shifted from blue to purple, then to deep black. The mountains were silhouetted against the darkening sky, and the air grew colder. The wind picked up, rattling the windows. I made a cup of tea, lit a few candles, and tried to enjoy the stillness. But as the hours passed, something began to feel off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first. The house creaked as old buildings do. The wind howled outside, as mountain winds tend to do. But it wasn't just that. It was the way the silence felt too deep, like it was pressing against me. I tried to shake off the feeling. I was alone, sure, but there was no reason to be scared. I wasn't a child. By the time I went to bed, I had convinced myself that it was just the unfamiliarity of the place getting to me. I pulled the covers up and settled into the old bed. The sheets were soft but smelled faintly of must and age, and the wooden frame groaned with every slight movement. But it was comfortable enough, and soon exhaustion overtook me. I woke up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding. I wasn't sure what had woken me, whether it was a sound or just a sudden sense of unease, but I lay there in the dark, straining to listen. For a long time, all I could hear was the wind outside, the occasional crackle of the fire in the hearth. But then I heard it, faint, like a tapping noise. I held my breath, listening harder. It wasn't a loud sound, but it was distinct. It came from somewhere deep in the cabin, maybe from the roof, maybe from the walls. I tried to ignore it. It was probably just a tree branch scraping against the roof or a loose board in the walls shifting in the wind. But the noise persisted, soft but constant, like something or someone was gently tapping on the wood. I got up and walked into the living room, heart racing. The fire was still low, casting long shadows across the room. The tapping stopped as soon as I reached the doorway. I checked the windows. Everything was locked. The door was secure. Nothing seemed out of place. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the house settling. But there was still that nagging feeling at the back of my mind. I returned to bed, trying to convince myself that I was being irrational. But sleep didn't come easily. Every little noise, every creak of the house seemed amplified in the silence of the night. I kept telling myself that everything was fine, that I was just imagining things, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I woke to a thick fog blanketing the valley outside. It was one of those mornings where the world seemed to disappear into a gray mist, and the air was damp with the promise of rain. I made a simple breakfast and decided to get some fresh air. I needed to clear my head. I went outside, pulling on a jacket against the chill, and started walking down the narrow path that led away from the cabin. The ground was wet from the night's dew, and the mist curled around the trees like smoke. It was beautiful in a haunting sort of way. I walked for hours, letting the solitude soak in. As I explored further, I noticed that the woods around the cabin felt different. The trees were densely packed, their branches thick with leaves, and the ground was uneven and full of roots that seemed to trip me up with every step. There was an unsettling quiet, though no birds, no animals, nothing that might give the place a sense of life. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant murmur of wind through the trees. I kept walking, trying to push away the discomfort that had begun to settle in my chest. But then I saw it. A small clearing appeared up ahead, and in the center of it was a structure. At first, I thought it was a shed or an old barn, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't any building I recognized. It was more like a shack, though it looked abandoned, like no one had been there in years. The wood was weathered, the roof sagging in places, and the windows were completely boarded up. I approached cautiously, drawn to the strange structure but also repelled by it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I got closer. I reached for the door, but the moment my hand touched the rusted handle, I heard a loud crack from behind me. Something heavy breaking, snapping under the weight of something large. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just trees. The sound had come from deeper in the woods. My heart raced. Maybe it was an animal, but it didn't sound like one. It sounded too deliberate. I stood frozen for a moment, listening. There was no other sound. Nothing moved. I slowly backed away from the shack, not willing to risk going any closer. I returned to the cabin, my mind racing. Something about that place, that shack, didn't sit right with me. It was as if it had been waiting for me to find it. That night, I didn't sleep much. The tapping returned, louder now, and this time, it wasn't just a soft sound. It was a rhythmic pounding, like someone or something was knocking on the walls of the cabin over and over. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The noise came from all directions, each tap feeling like it was getting closer. At some point, I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and began checking every room. There was nothing, no one, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I was being watched. The next morning, I packed up my things. I couldn't stay there anymore. The unease, the tapping, the feeling that something wasn't right. It was all too much. I left the cabin behind, the mountain roads winding back down into civilization. I never told anyone about the strange sounds or the shack in the woods. Maybe it was all in my head, maybe not. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling that the woods around that cabin are hiding something. Something I was never meant to find. Something that waits, patient and still, in the mist. I was 32 the summer I decided to take some time away from everything. My name is Martin Reynolds, and I had been working nonstop as a civil engineer in Fort Collins, Colorado. I had taken maybe 2 vacations in the last 8 years, and both of them were short and tied to weddings or family obligations. I was burned out, plain and simple. I needed real space, something away from cities, phones, people, traffic, and noise. I wanted to sleep in, breathe mountain air, make my own food, and just reset. In July of 2017, I took 4 weeks off work, something I hadn't done since college. I found a cabin for rent on a site that catered to off-the-grid locations. It was tucked up in the Roosevelt National Forest, about a 3-hour drive from my apartment. The listing said it had no internet, no cell service, and was solar-powered with a backup generator. There was a well, a basic kitchen, and a wood stove. The pictures showed a rustic but solid A-frame cabin sitting in a little clearing surrounded by tall lodgepole pines. I booked it for 3 weeks and paid up front. I packed everything I thought I'd need. I brought a small cooler, a few changes of clothes, hiking boots, books, a hunting knife, a portable solar charger for emergencies, and a box of freeze-dried meals, just in case. I also brought a used .22 rifle I'd bought years ago but never really had a chance to use. It wasn't for hunting. I just felt better having it around in case of animals or weirdos. The place was remote, and something about being completely alone that far up in the mountains made me a little uneasy, even if I didn't want to admit it. I drove out early in the morning on a Sunday, following the directions the owner had emailed. After turning off the main road, I spent nearly an hour on a narrow dirt trail that wound through thick pine forest and climbed higher than I expected. The last few miles were the worst, deep ruts, sharp rocks, and a steep drop-off on one side. My SUV barely made it up a few stretches. The tires kicked up dust and the vehicle rattled the whole way. If I had come in winter or during heavy rain, I don't think I would have made it at all. By the time I reached the clearing, it was almost evening. The sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows. The air was still and cool. I stepped out of the car, stretched, and looked around. It was quiet. No birds, no insects, just wind moving through pine needles. The cabin looked exactly like the photos. Weathered with siding, green metal roof, and a small deck out front. There was a stack of firewood by the door and a solar panel mounted on a pole off to the side. Behind the cabin, the forest sloped upward into rocky hills. I unlocked the front door with the key from the lockbox and stepped inside. The place was small but well kept. There was a main room with a bed, a wood stove, a table, a few shelves, and a small kitchen tucked into the corner. A narrow ladder led up to a loft above, which was empty except for an old mattress. Everything smelled faintly of pine and ash. There were no signs of mice or bugs. I was relieved. It felt like I had really gotten away. That first night, I made myself a basic dinner, read for a while, and went to bed early. The silence was hard to get used to. In the city, there's always something Cars in the distance, neighbors, electricity humming. Here it was just nothing. I fell asleep with the windows open and the rifle leaning against the wall beside me. The next few days passed peacefully. I explored some of the trails around the cabin, cooked simple meals, and caught up on sleep. The forest felt endless. Every direction looked the same after a few minutes of walking. Tall trees, fallen logs, and soft ground covered in pine needles. I made sure not to wander too far without marking my route. I had no GPS or signal out here, and I didn't want to end up lost in the middle of nowhere. By the fourth night, something started to change. I noticed small things at first, barely worth paying attention to. One evening, I came back from a short hike and found that the chair on the front deck had been moved. Not by the wind, it had clearly been dragged a few feet to the left. I figured maybe I had done it earlier and just forgot. Then the next morning, I found a single muddy footprint by the back door. It was small, like a child's or a woman's boot. I hadn't seen a single person since I'd arrived. Still, I tried not to let it get to me. I told myself it was probably an old print that had been preserved somehow and I just hadn't noticed before. The mountains had a way of playing tricks on your senses. It was easy to get paranoid when you were completely alone. Couple more days went by. I was sleeping less soundly by then, waking up to small noises outside. Most of the time it was the wind or a pine cone falling onto the roof. Once or twice, though, I was sure I heard something move on the porch, slow and careful footsteps. I got up, turned on the outside light, which was dim and flickery from the weak battery, and saw nothing. The trees beyond the clearing looked back at me like walls. I stopped opening the windows at night after that. One morning, I woke up and found the storage hatch in the floor open. It led to a small crawl space under the cabin where the backup batteries and tools were stored. I had looked inside when I first arrived, closed it, and hadn't touched it since. Now it was wide open. The wooden lid was heavy, and I knew I hadn't opened it accidentally. I climbed down with a flashlight and checked the area. Everything looked untouched. I closed it again and placed a wooden wedge between the floor and the handle so I'd hear it if it opened again. By the end of the second week, I was fully on edge. I hadn't seen anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I started locking the doors even during the day. I kept the rifle with me everywhere, even when I went out to gather kindling. I was still trying to enjoy the quiet, but it didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like the woods were waiting. That night, it all came to a head. I had just finished eating and was sitting by the stove reading when I heard a faint noise from outside, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. I stood up and turned off the lantern. The moon was bright enough to see through the windows, but I didn't move closer. I just stood still, listening. Another sound, a soft creak from the front deck. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate steps. Not an animal, not a deer. Someone was walking up to the front door. I raised the rifle and waited. My heart was thudding so hard I felt it in my ears. The steps stopped just outside the door. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I aimed at the door and held my breath. After about a minute, I heard the steps again, moving around the side of the cabin, toward the back. I stepped quietly to the window and peeked through the curtain. I saw a shadow moving past, low to the ground. Not crawling, but crouched. It was a person, dressed in dark clothing, face obscured. They moved silently, almost practiced. I backed away from the window, locked the back door, and positioned myself at the corner of the room where I could see both entrances. My finger hovered over the trigger. Nothing happened for a long time. Then I heard the hatch under the floor creak open. I didn't even think. I rushed to it, slammed it shut, locked the latch, and slid the table over it. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the rifle. The rest of the night passed in complete silence. I stayed awake until morning, sitting against the wall with the gun in my lap, eyes on the door. When the sun came up, I packed everything I could into the SUV, slammed the gear into drive, and didn't stop until I reached a town with signal. I didn't care about the deposit or leaving early. I just wanted to be around people again. I called the owner from a gas station. He sounded surprised but didn't offer any explanation. Just said he'd check on the cabin later that week. I never went back. I don't even know if I locked the front door. I don't care. A week after I got home, I filed a report with the local sheriff's office. They took my statement but said there wasn't much they could do without evidence. No one had reported anything strange in the area, and the nearest ranger station was over 20 miles from the cabin. The forest was too big to search without a solid lead. I didn't hear anything back. No follow-up, no update, just silence. A few months later, I looked up the rental site again. The listing was gone. I still think about it sometimes late at night. That quiet, crouching figure, the open hatch, the way the forest seemed to press in around the cabin. I don't know who they were, or how long they had been watching me. Maybe since the day I arrived. Maybe even before that. All I know is that I've never felt safe in the woods again. Not truly, not the way I used to, and I will never, ever rent a remote cabin again. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend away from everything. The kind of weekend where I could just disconnect from the world, get away from the noise of the city, and enjoy some solitude. I had rented a small cabin deep in the woods, a place far from any towns, and even farther from any cell phone service. It seemed perfect. Just me, a few good books, and a small campfire to keep me company. I had arrived on a Friday evening, just as the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. The drive up had been long but quiet, the roads winding through dense forests, the trees growing thick and tall on either side. By the time I reached the cabin, it was already getting dark. The place was old, but it had that cozy charm to it. The wooden beams creaked as I walked around, and the smell of pine and wood smoke filled the air. I set my things down inside, unpacked a few essentials, and started a fire in the small stone fireplace. The flickering light cast long shadows on the walls, and for a moment, it felt like I was the only person left in the world. I made a quick dinner, a simple meal of soup and bread, and sat down by the fire, eating and listening to the crackle of the flames. After dinner, I went outside to enjoy the crisp evening air. The stars were bright, scattered across the sky like diamonds, and the only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Felt like everything was in its right place. There was no rush, no deadlines, no pressure. Just the stillness of the night and the solitude I had been craving. I stayed outside for a while, just breathing in the fresh air, when I heard something. It was faint at first, just a small sound, like something brushing against the ground. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe an animal, but then it came again, louder this time, a definite rustling sound coming from the trees. My heart skipped a beat. I paused, listening closely. It wasn't an animal. It was too heavy, too deliberate. My breath caught in my throat as the rustling continued. I could feel my senses sharpen, every muscle in my body going on alert. I didn't know what it was, but it didn't feel right. It wasn't the kind of noise you'd hear from deer or raccoons. This was something bigger, something purposeful. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. After all, I was alone in the woods, and the mind can play tricks when it's left to its own devices. But the noise didn't stop. It was getting closer. I quickly retreated back inside the cabin, locking the door behind me. I couldn't help but feel foolish, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that something wasn't right. I moved to the window and peered through the curtains. All I could see was the dark expanse of the forest, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. There was nothing out there, nothing at all, but the feeling remained. I couldn't shake the sense that something or someone was out there, watching. I spent the next few hours in the cabin, reading a book, occasionally glancing nervously out the window. The noises never came back, but the unease lingered. By the time I finally went to bed, I had convinced myself it was just my imagination running wild. After all, I was in the middle of nowhere, in a cabin that had probably been sitting empty for years. It wasn't unusual for sounds to travel strangely in the woods, but sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept tossing and turning, hearing every creak of the cabin and every snap of a twig outside. It felt like the darkness was closing in on me, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting a soft glow through the cabin's small windows. I woke up feeling groggy but decided to head out for a hike. Maybe some fresh air and exercise would help clear my head. I grabbed my gear and set off along a trail that wound through the trees. It was peaceful again. The only sounds the crunch of my boots on the trail and the occasional bird call. As I walked deeper into the woods, I tried to focus on the beauty around me. The towering trees, the fresh scent of pine, the quiet rustle of leaves. But the unease from the night before still clung to me. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone watching me from the shadows. I wasn't sure how much time had passed when I came across something strange. It was a small clearing, nothing out of the ordinary, except for a pile of broken branches and scattered debris in the center. At first, I thought it was just the remnants of a fallen tree, but as I got closer, I realized that wasn't the case. The branches had been deliberately placed, arranged in a way that didn't make sense. They formed a crude, circular shape, as though something or someone had intentionally created this pile. There was no sign of a fire, no sign of an animal, just a strange, unsettling arrangement in the middle of the clearing. I stood there for a moment, frozen, trying to make sense of it. Then, as I looked around the clearing, I noticed something else. The ground around the pile of branches was disturbed, as if something heavy had recently been dragged through the dirt. There were deep impressions in the earth, as if something had been moved, something big. I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned around quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. The trail behind me seemed longer now, the trees towering above me, casting long, threatening shadows. I wasn't sure what had happened in that clearing, but it was clear I wasn't alone. Whoever or whatever had left those marks was nearby. I hiked back to the cabin as quickly as I could, not looking back once. The entire walk felt wrong, every rustle in the trees making me jump. When I finally reached the cabin, I locked the door behind me and sat down on the couch, trying to calm my nerves. I needed to think, to make a plan, but the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. The pile of branches, the disturbed earth, it didn't add up. It wasn't the work of animals, and it definitely wasn't the work of someone just passing through. I spent the rest of the day inside the cabin, too anxious to venture out again. The sun was starting to set when I heard it again, the rustling. This time it was unmistakable. It was coming from just outside the cabin. Slowly, carefully, I moved to the window, peeking through the curtains. I could see a figure, barely visible in the growing darkness, moving between the trees. My heart stopped. Whoever it was, they were too close. I couldn't just sit here and wait. I grabbed my phone, but as I expected, there was no signal. I was alone, and I didn't know who or what was out there. I spent the rest of the evening in a state of heightened alert, the sound of footsteps growing louder as night fell. Each creak of the cabin's floorboards sent my heart racing, and I couldn't help but wonder how much longer I could stay here without knowing what was going on outside. The woods were no longer peaceful. They were dangerous, and I had no way of getting out. The next morning, I packed up my things and left. I didn't even look back as I drove away, the roads winding through the woods, taking me back to civilization. It was a long drive home, but I didn't care. I was just glad to be out of that cabin, away from whatever was lurking in the trees. And as I drove, I couldn't help but feel a nagging sense of dread. The rustling, the figure, the disturbed earth, they had all been real. But what they meant, I couldn't say. I was 38 when I finally took time off from work. I had spent years behind a desk, managing logistics for a shipping company out in Indiana. The job paid well, but I always felt like I was suffocating under emails, phone calls, and spreadsheets. When my boss approved 2 weeks off in late October of 2019, I didn't think twice. I needed quiet, distance, and space away from the noise and pressure. I decided to rent a cabin in northern Minnesota, near a small place called Birch Hollow. I'd never heard of it until I started browsing rental sites, but it looked perfect. Isolated, surrounded by woods, about half an hour from the nearest gas station. The listing mentioned a small lake nearby and hiking trails in every direction. It sounded like exactly what I needed. I packed up my Jeep, loaded it with groceries, a cooler, some firewood, and a few essentials, nothing fancy. Just some books, a thermos, my old fishing rod, a basic first aid kit, and a 9mm pistol I kept locked in a box under the front seat. I had a concealed carry permit and had always taken safety seriously, even in peaceful areas. I didn't expect trouble. I just liked to be ready. The drive from Indianapolis took nearly 11 hours. I broke it up with stops for gas and food, but by the time I rolled into Birch Hollow, it was already getting dark. The place was even smaller than I imagined. Just a few houses, a rundown diner, and a general store. I didn't stop. The road that led to the cabin twisted away from town and narrowed as I got deeper into the woods. The gravel turned rough, and my tires kicked up dust and small rocks. Trees pressed in on both sides, their branches bare and reaching after the fall drop. The cold air fogged my windows, and I had to crank the heat just to stay comfortable. I passed a wooden sign nailed to a post that said 10 Lakes Trail, and shortly after that, I found the dirt driveway leading to the cabin. It was smaller than I expected. The photos made it seem bigger, but standing there, headlights catching the porch, it looked worn down. There were a few patches on the roof, the steps sagged under my weight, and the windows were streaked with grime. But it had power, running water, and the front door lock worked fine. That was enough. I unloaded everything, stacked the firewood beside the stone fireplace inside, and put the groceries in the small refrigerator. I lit a few candles, even though the electricity was on, just to make it feel a little more homey. Then I sat down on the couch, wrapped in my coat, and just listened. The silence was thick. No traffic, no voices, no buzzing of phones. Just wind in the trees and an occasional creak from the wood beams overhead. The first night passed quietly. I slept in the small bedroom at the back, wrapped in layers of blankets. The old heating system made odd clicking sounds, and once or twice, I woke up thinking I heard something outside, but it was probably branches snapping or raccoons near the trash bin. The next morning, I woke before dawn. I made coffee on the stovetop, pulled on boots, and walked down to the lake. It was about a 5-minute hike through the trees. The water was cold and dark, the surface like glass. I cast my line a few times, didn't catch anything, and just sat there for a while. I liked the quiet. For the next few days, I settled into a routine. Coffee early, walks through the woods, long naps, and reading by the fire. My phone had no signal, which was fine. That's what I wanted. On the 4th day, though, things started to feel strange. I noticed small things at first. One morning, I found a boot print in the mud behind the cabin. It wasn't mine. I checked. Mine had a wide heel and deep treads. This one was narrower with a different pattern, almost like a hiking boot. I tried not to read into it. Maybe someone passed through while hunting, even though there were no signs posted and I hadn't seen a soul since I got there. That night, I heard movement outside. Not animals, not wind, footsteps, measured, slow, almost deliberate. I turned off the lights, stood near the window, and listened. I didn't see anything. Eventually, the sound stopped. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, checked the windows and doors. No signs of damage, but I felt uneasy. I told myself it was probably just a deer, maybe even a moose, but it didn't feel right. I started keeping my pistol closer. I cleaned it, loaded it, and kept it on the table by the door, just in case. I also stopped walking far from the cabin. I stayed close, stayed alert. On the 7th day, something changed. I woke to the sound of my Jeep's alarm blaring. I threw on a jacket, grabbed the pistol, and ran outside. The cold bit through my clothes, but I didn't care. The alarm stopped just as I stepped off the porch. My headlights flashed once, then nothing. I walked to the Jeep. Nothing seemed broken. The doors were locked. No windows smashed, but someone had tried to open it. There were fresh fingerprints on the handle, smudged, oily, and a faint footprint on the driver's side window, almost like someone had leaned against it. I wiped the handle clean, popped the hood, and disabled the alarm system completely. If someone was messing around, I didn't want to give them any reason to disable it violently next time. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark, pistol on my lap, watching the windows. Around 2 a.m., I heard the same slow steps outside. This time, they came around the back. I crept to the rear window, careful not to make a sound. In the moonlight, I saw him. A man, tall, wearing a heavy coat, face shadowed under a hood, stood about 20 feet from the cabin, staring at the back door. He didn't move. He just stood there. I froze. My mouth went dry. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I knew he was watching. I held the pistol tight but didn't raise it. I didn't want to draw attention. After nearly 5 minutes, he turned and walked away. Slow, calm, like he wasn't worried about being seen. I stayed by the window until dawn. When the sun came up, I searched the area. I found prints in the frost-covered ground, same boot tread as before. He had stood there, staring, watching, and then vanished into the woods. I packed that afternoon. I didn't care if I had days left. I wanted out, but when I went to start the Jeep, it wouldn't turn over. I checked the battery. Fine. I checked the gas. Still had a quarter tank. I tried again. Just a clicking noise. I popped the hood, leaned in, and that's when I saw it. The wires were cut. Someone had opened the hood and sliced the ignition wires. Clean cuts, like with a knife. Whoever he was, he didn't want me leaving. I backed away from the car, closed the hood, and went back inside. I locked every door, bolted the windows, and pulled the blinds tight. I kept the pistol in my hand. I didn't sleep that night either. I barely breathed. In the morning, I tried to think logically. There was a gas station about 6 miles south. I could hike it, bring water, wear warm clothes, keep my pistol in my coat. The thought of walking through the woods alone terrified me, but I couldn't stay. Around noon, I made my move. I packed a bag, locked up the cabin, and followed the road out. It was colder than I expected. Clouds covered the sun, and the wind never let up. Every sound made me flinch. Every squirrel, every branch snapping. It all felt like him. About 3 miles in, I found something that stopped me cold. A tarp, stretched between 2 trees, hidden just off the road, behind some thick brush. I wouldn't have seen it if a gust hadn't lifted the corner. I stepped closer, heart pounding. Underneath, there were supplies. A camping stove, cans of food, binoculars, rope, and a pair of bolt cutters. There was also a map with the cabin circled in red ink. Lines were drawn from the cabin to surrounding points. Notes in the margins: arrives early, wakes at dawn, keeps gun inside. He had been watching me for days. I ran. I didn't think. I just ran. My legs burned. Lungs screamed. But I didn't stop until I saw the old wooden sign for the gas station. I stumbled inside, covered in sweat and shaking. The guy behind the counter looked up, startled, but I just pointed to the phone. I called the police. They arrived within 30 minutes. I told them everything. I brought them to the tarp, the supplies, the cabin. They saw the cut wires, the boot prints, everything. They searched the woods but never found him. He had vanished, like smoke. I gave my statement, stayed in a motel overnight, and left the next morning with a tow truck pulling my Jeep. I never went back. The cabin listing was removed 2 weeks later. It's been years now. I still think about him, about how he knew where I was, what I did, even when I slept, about how close I came to disappearing out there without anyone knowing. I bought a house in the suburbs after that. Cameras on every corner. I never go into the woods anymore. Not alone. Not ever. Because someone out there still remembers that cabin. And he wasn't just watching me. He was planning something much worse. The cabin sat on the edge of a dense, snow-covered forest in the mountains, isolated from everything. It was the middle of November, and the first heavy snowstorm of the season had just rolled in. I was 32, and I had never really been one for camping, but after months of working in a high-stress office job, I thought a weekend getaway would be the perfect way to decompress. I found the cabin online, advertised as a quiet, remote place to escape the hustle and bustle of the city. It was a small, rustic wooden structure with a few windows, a stone fireplace, and the kind of silence you only find in places far from civilization. I drove up alone. My plan was to spend 2 nights there, reading, cooking, and just enjoying the peace. I arrived late in the afternoon with the storm picking up speed. The snow was falling so heavily by the time I reached the cabin that the roads had started to look more like winding trails. I made sure to stock up on supplies, enough food, firewood, and water to last me a couple of days. I also had some camping gear just in case. I hadn't expected a storm of this magnitude, but I figured I'd be fine. The cabin was simple. Inside, there was an old couch, a kitchen table, and a few chairs. The kitchen was equipped with a small stove and a wood-burning oven. The bathroom had a small shower and toilet, nothing fancy. The place felt quiet, even when the wind howled outside. The first evening was peaceful. I lit a fire, made some soup, and spent the night reading by the warmth of the flames. The wind outside howled fiercely, the snow pounding against the walls, but inside, I was comfortable. I went to bed early, feeling the exhaustion of the long drive and the stress that had built up over the months finally starting to leave my body. The next day, I woke up early, the sky outside still dark and overcast. The storm hadn't let up, but it had slowed to a constant, heavy fall of snow. I knew I wouldn't be going anywhere today, so I spent most of the morning cooking a big breakfast and reading. It was almost idyllic, the solitude, the quiet, the soft crackle of the fire. But after a while, I started to feel like I had too much time on my hands, and the silence became oppressive. I went outside for a bit to stretch my legs and clear my head. The snow had piled up several feet, and the path leading to the cabin was nearly obscured by drifts. I walked around for a bit, careful not to venture too far. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no animals, just the occasional creaking of trees under the weight of the snow. As I wandered, I kept glancing back at the cabin, as if I expected something to happen. The thought seemed strange, almost silly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I returned inside, I noticed something odd. The door, which I was sure I had closed tightly before going outside, was slightly ajar. I had locked it, but it wasn't fully closed. I couldn't explain it. It didn't make sense. I chalked it up to the wind, though the idea seemed a little too convenient. Later, as the storm continued to rage outside, I felt more and more like something wasn't right. The cabin was too quiet, and every little sound, the crack of the wood in the fire, the wind against the walls, sounded exaggerated, unnaturally loud. I tried to dismiss it, but I found myself double-checking the windows and doors, making sure they were all secure. Night came quickly, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. I ate a simple dinner, then settled in by the fire. The wind outside was deafening, and I couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the windows. The entire world seemed swallowed by the storm. I felt a sense of isolation, but it was different now, more unsettling. Around midnight, I was sitting on the couch, half asleep when I heard something, a sound from outside. It was a faint rustling, like something was moving through the snow. My heart skipped. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear trying to find shelter from the storm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. It didn't sound like anything I had heard before. It was a steady, deliberate sound, like someone walking through the snow. I stood up, heart racing, and grabbed the flashlight from the table. The storm was too loud for me to hear much beyond the walls of the cabin. I couldn't see anything through the windows except the white blur of snow, but I could feel my pulse quickening. I walked to the front door, cautiously peeking out the small crack between the door and the frame. Nothing. I closed the door and locked it again, my hands trembling. I told myself it was nothing, just the storm. It was getting to me. I tried to push it from my mind, but I couldn't. I was no longer alone in the cabin. I could feel it. The next morning, I woke to an unusual silence. The storm had stopped, but the snow had thickened, blanketing everything in white. It was so still outside that I could hear the soft crunch of snow under my boots as I stepped out onto the porch. My breath hung in the cold air as I surveyed the surroundings. Everything looked untouched, as if the storm had wiped the world clean. But then I saw it, footprints in the snow, leading right up to the cabin. The tracks were fresh, not more than a few hours old. The snow was undisturbed around them, except where someone or something had walked. The tracks were large, irregular, like someone had been trudging through the snow for a long time, but they weren't in any clear pattern. They were erratic, almost as if they were searching. My heart started to race. I scanned the area, but there was no one around. No sign of anyone. The woods around me were silent. The panic hit me in waves. Who had been outside? How had they gotten so close without me hearing anything? My first instinct was to pack up and leave, but the snow was thick, and the storm had made the roads impassable. I had no choice but to stay, at least until the roads cleared. But now, more than ever, I didn't want to be there. The rest of the day passed slowly. I stayed inside the cabin, checking the doors and windows, looking out at the forest. The footprints were still there, and I couldn't stop staring at them, wondering if they would lead to something or someone waiting just outside. As night fell, I made sure everything was locked tight. I ate a quick dinner and tried to calm my nerves by reading, but the noise outside, the cracking of branches, the shifting of snow, was too much. Every time I heard something, my heart would jump, expecting someone to knock on the door. At around 11 p.m., I heard it again. The soft crunching of footsteps in the snow, but this time they were closer. The sounds were deliberate, heavy, as if someone was standing just outside the door, listening. I froze. I didn't know what to do. If I stayed inside, would they break in? If I ran, would they follow me? I could feel the fear creeping up my spine. I didn't know what was out there, but I knew it wasn't just the storm. I grabbed the small axe by the fireplace, my hands shaking as I gripped the handle. I stood still, listening. The footsteps continued, but now I could hear something else. A low, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled through the snow. The sound grew closer, and my breath caught in my throat. Then there was a knock, a slow, deliberate knock on the cabin door. I felt like my heart had stopped. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me. After what felt like an eternity, the knock came again. But this time it was followed by a voice. Help! Couldn't breathe. I didn't know if I should answer. Part of me wanted to rush outside, to open the door and see who was out there. But the other part of me knew that I couldn't. I couldn't trust this voice, not with everything that had happened so far. I stayed frozen, the axe still in my hand. The knocking stopped, and the dragging sound faded into the distance. It took a long time before I felt safe enough to let go of the axe. I stayed awake for hours, listening, waiting for the sound of footsteps, but nothing came. By morning, the footprints outside had disappeared, covered by fresh snow. I didn't know who or what had been out there, but I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be staying another night. I packed up as quickly as I could, loaded up my car, and drove away. As I left, I glanced back at the cabin in the rearview mirror, knowing I'd never return. Whatever had happened out there, I didn't want to know. I never thought I would end up in a situation like this. No one ever really does. I had gone into the woods because I needed time to think. It was just a simple weekend getaway, far away from the noise of the city. Just a small cabin I rented for the weekend on the outskirts of a quiet little town in Oregon. No one else around for miles, they said. Perfect for clearing your mind, they promised. I arrived on a Thursday night, the air cool and crisp. I could smell the trees and the wet earth from the rain earlier in the week. I wasn't a fan of the whole off-the-grid thing, but it had seemed like a good idea at the time. The cabin was nothing special, old, a little worn, with a small porch and a fire pit. But it had a fireplace inside and a view of the mountains in the distance, which I thought would be perfect for reading a book and relaxing. The first evening passed without incident. I unpacked my things, made a small fire, and settled into the chair near the hearth. The sound of the crackling wood was calming, almost meditative, but the stillness of the forest around me was unsettling. I don't know why. There was just something about it. Maybe it was the fact that I was alone out here, with no one to rely on but myself. The thought of being in a place so remote, so cut off from everything, was a little too much at times. The night grew darker, and the quiet stretched out into a heavy silence. I was getting ready to head to bed when I heard something. The first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the trees. But then it happened again. A thud came from somewhere outside the cabin. My heart started to race. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something else native to the area. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I stood at the window, peering into the darkness. The only light outside was from the half moon, barely illuminating the trees. The thud came again, closer this time. I told myself it was probably just a tree branch falling or something along those lines. Still, the silence around me felt unnatural. I decided to go check it out. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the porch, the cool night air biting at my skin. My heart thudded louder with each step I took, my boots crunching on the gravel path leading to the edge of the clearing. The noise stopped. I stood there in the dark, scanning the area. Nothing, just trees. The feeling of being watched was stronger now. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared. I turned to head back to the cabin when I heard something move behind me. I froze. The sound was soft but distinct, something moving through the brush. I spun around, shining the flashlight in the direction of the noise. The beam swept over the forest floor, but I didn't see anything. The air around me felt heavier, thicker. The unease deepened in my stomach, but I told myself to calm down. There was no reason to panic. I slowly turned back to the cabin and made my way inside. The door creaked shut behind me, and I locked it for good measure. I stood there in the darkened cabin, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched, but it lingered. The next day, I decided to take a hike to distract myself. I couldn't stay cooped up in the cabin the whole weekend. I grabbed my backpack, loaded it with some water, snacks, and a map of the nearby trails, and set off on foot. The woods around the cabin were dense, but the trail was clear. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The only sound was the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant calls of birds. I hiked for a few hours, taking in the beauty of the forest. The air was fresh, the trees towering above me like silent sentinels. The further I went, the quieter it became. I could hear my breath, steady and deep, but little else. The forest around me seemed to swallow up all the sound. It was when I reached a small clearing that I noticed something strange. There, at the far edge of the clearing, was an old, abandoned cabin. I had no idea it was there. The map didn't show any structures nearby. The cabin was smaller than the one I had rented, old, with a dilapidated roof and broken windows. It was obvious no one had lived there for a long time. Still, there was something about it that caught my attention. Couldn't resist. I walked over to it, drawn in by some inexplicable force. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the hinges rusty from years of neglect. Inside, the air was stale, musty, and damp. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I stepped inside. I shone my flashlight around the dark room. Dust settled in the beam of light, and old furniture was scattered about. An overturned chair, a wooden table with one leg missing. Something about the place felt off, but I couldn't place it. The silence was thick, oppressive. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in. A feeling of dread washed over me, but I tried to shake it off. It was just an old cabin, nothing more. Then, I noticed something on the wall, a strange marking, scratched into the wood. It wasn't deep, but it was definitely deliberate. I leaned closer, trying to make sense of it. It looked like a symbol, though I didn't recognize it. My curiosity got the best of me, and I reached out to touch it. As my fingers brushed against the wall, I heard something, a low, guttural noise from somewhere deep within the cabin. I snapped my hand back, heart racing. The noise was faint, but unmistakable. It sounded like breathing. I stood there, frozen in place, straining to hear, but the cabin was silent again. The air felt cold now, much colder than it had been before. I didn't waste any more time. I backed out of the cabin, my mind racing, and made my way back to the trail. When I got back to the main trail, I felt a little better, but the uneasy feeling still hadn't gone away. The rest of the hike was a blur. I barely registered the passing scenery, lost in my thoughts. The image of that cabin, the strange symbol, the breathing, it all lingered in my mind. That evening, I sat by the fire in the cabin, trying to push the events of the day out of my mind. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the trees. The cabin creaked and groaned, its old bones protesting the gusts. But the warmth of the fire kept the chill at bay, and I was starting to feel a bit more at ease. But then I heard it again. A soft thud came from outside. I immediately froze, my breath catching in my throat. I knew what it was, the same noise I had heard the night before. I stood up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence that followed the thud felt heavier this time. It was as if something was waiting, watching. The thud came again, closer this time. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and headed outside, my feet crunching on the gravel path. The air was cold, the wind biting at my skin. I stood on the porch, scanning the area with the beam of the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but I didn't see anything. Then, I heard something behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The forest around me was still, too still. I knew I wasn't alone. My instincts screamed at me to get back inside, but my legs wouldn't move. I stood frozen, my hand gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white. A branch snapped in the distance, then another. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, reached my ears. I was not alone. The flashlight flickered. I jerked the flashlight back on, but it was too late. The figure was already moving toward me. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, just a break from the daily grind. I had been feeling the weight of work and life press down on me, and when I found this cabin rental in the woods, it seemed perfect. The photos online promised a small, cozy log cabin tucked away in a secluded corner of the mountains. There was no cell service, no distractions, just the quiet sounds of nature. It was everything I thought I needed. I rented the cabin for 3 days, thinking that would be enough to recharge my batteries. The place was about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. The road leading up to it was narrow and bumpy, with trees on either side so thick that the sunlight barely made it through the canopy. When I finally arrived, the place was more remote than I'd imagined. The cabin was small, made of dark, weathered logs. It looked exactly like what you'd picture in a hiking brochure: rustic, charming, and isolated. Perfect escape. The inside was simple: a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area with a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a couple of old leather chairs by the fireplace. The bedroom had a queen-sized bed, flanked by a small nightstand on either side. Nothing fancy, but it felt right. The cabin had a certain warmth to it, though there was a bit of an odd smell, a mixture of damp wood and old leather. It didn't bother me much, though. I was too excited about being away from the noise of the city to focus on it. The first evening was uneventful. I unpacked my things, made a simple dinner of pasta and salad, and settled in with a book by the fire. It wasn't until after dark that the first strange thing happened. I had just finished eating when I heard a sound outside, a faint rustling, like something moving through the leaves. At first, I thought it was just a raccoon or some other small animal, but the noise was louder than I expected. Came again, closer this time. I stood up from my chair, peering out the window, but there was nothing. The night was thick, and the trees outside were dark shadows in the moonlight. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just the wind or maybe a deer. After all, this was the woods. I returned to my book, trying to push the feeling of unease away. That night, I slept fitfully. Every few hours, I'd wake up, unsure of whether I had heard something outside or if it was just my mind playing tricks. Around 3 a.m., I heard a loud thud against the side of the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. I lay there, frozen, listening. Then, just as suddenly, everything went quiet. No rustling, no footsteps, just the sound of the wind outside. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch had fallen, or maybe an animal had brushed up against the cabin. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a branch or an animal. Felt wrong. The next day, I decided to go for a hike to clear my head. The sun was out, and the air was crisp. Perfect weather for a walk. I took a trail I found nearby, one that followed a small creek that ran through the woods. The sound of the water was calming, and for a while, I almost forgot about the unease I'd felt the night before. But then, just as I was crossing a small wooden bridge, I noticed something odd: footprints in the mud. The tracks were large, heavy, and seemed fresh, as if someone had passed through just moments ago. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. Big boots, the kind that you'd wear for hiking or working outdoors. They seemed to be heading in the direction of the cabin. My stomach dropped. I stood there for a while, staring at the footprints, trying to make sense of them. There were no other signs of life, no cars, no people on the trail. I tried to convince myself that it was just someone else staying in a nearby cabin, maybe a ranger or another hiker. But the feeling of dread was hard to shake off. After another hour on the trail, I made my way back to the cabin, but I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. When I arrived back, everything looked normal. The cabin was quiet, undisturbed, but the feeling I had last night came rushing back, stronger this time. I locked the door, even though I wasn't sure why. It seemed like the thing to do, but deep down, I wondered if locking the door would make a difference if someone really wanted to get in. That night, I decided to take extra precautions. I pulled the furniture in front of the door to make sure no one could just walk in. I checked all the windows, double-checked the locks, and even set up a chair next to the fireplace so I could hear anyone approaching. The night passed uneventfully at first, but around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps outside, slow, deliberate, almost as if someone was pacing around the cabin. I lay still, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear, but the steps didn't sound like any animal I knew. The pacing went on for what felt like an eternity, circling the cabin, then stopping for a moment before starting again. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't dare move. Every time the footsteps paused, I thought for sure someone was at the door, just waiting for me to make a sound. But the footsteps never stopped long enough for me to gather the courage to check. It wasn't until the sun started to rise, casting faint light through the small cracks in the walls, that the sound stopped. I spent the rest of the morning staring at the door, my back pressed against the wall, heart still racing. I kept asking myself what I should do. Should I call the police? Should I leave? But the isolation of the cabin made me feel trapped. The nearest town was a long drive away, and there was no cell service. I couldn't just pack up and leave without taking a real risk. The next few hours were a blur. I spent them alternating between trying to figure out what was happening and convincing myself I was overreacting. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But that theory fell apart when I stepped outside around noon to find something new. A large stone, the kind that could be used as a weapon, placed deliberately in front of the cabin's door. Whoever had been outside had been watching me. That was when I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed up my things in a hurry, making sure to check all the windows one last time. As I grabbed my backpack, I heard a noise, a tapping against the window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I realized something. The sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It wasn't natural. I turned slowly, expecting to see a branch tapping against the glass. But there was nothing outside, nothing but the woods. I left the cabin, the sense of dread hanging over me like a shadow. I drove away as fast as I could, my mind racing. I kept expecting someone to appear in my rearview mirror, to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. But there was nothing. When I finally made it back to town, I stopped at a small cafe, needing a moment to calm down. I sat there, breathing in the smell of coffee, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't safe yet. The cabin was still in my mind, the footsteps, the stone, the tapping. It all felt too deliberate, too coordinated to be the work of some random person or animal. As I sat there, I overheard a conversation at the next table, a couple talking about the area I had stayed in. The woman mentioned hearing strange noises in the woods at night. Her friend laughed it off, saying it was probably just wild animals. But the woman's voice dropped, and she added something I hadn't expected. They say people go missing in those woods. It's been happening for years. That was when I realized that I had narrowly avoided something far worse than a few footsteps in the night. Whoever had been outside my cabin wasn't just some curious hiker or a person passing through. There was something darker going on, something I had been lucky to escape from. I never went back to that cabin. To this day, I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I'm grateful I left when I did. I don't talk about it much, but the feeling I had that night, the sense of being hunted, of being watched, is something I will never forget. It was the summer of 2019 when I decided I needed a real break from everything. I had just turned 34, and after nearly a decade of working long hours in corporate IT in Sacramento, I hit a wall. I wasn't sleeping right, wasn't eating well, and I'd developed this constant twitch in my left eye. I had money saved, and I'd already turned in my resignation letter a few weeks earlier, so I didn't owe anyone anything. I just needed to get away. No Wi-Fi, no traffic, no people. Just air, trees, and quiet. I found the cabin listing on a small, local site, nothing like Airbnb. It was part of an older network of rustic rentals in southern Oregon, somewhere near the Umpqua National Forest. The photos were simple: weathered wood exterior, small deck, wood stove, one bedroom. No phone reception. You had to bring your own water and food. I liked the idea of disconnecting from the grid, so I booked it for 4 weeks starting in early August. I drove up alone in my old Ford Escape, packed to the roof with canned food, propane tanks, a portable solar panel, and my fishing gear. I even brought a couple of paperbacks and a thick sketch pad, just in case I finally felt like drawing again. The drive took me about 7 hours with only 2 short breaks. The road got rough after a while. Potholes, overgrown edges, no signs. Eventually, my GPS stopped working altogether, so I had to rely on the printed directions I'd brought. They were handwritten with landmarks like, turn right at the fork near the 2 white boulders, and past the fallen log that looks like a bear. I didn't love that, but I figured it added to the charm. Still, by the time I finally saw the cabin through the trees, it was already late afternoon, and I was exhausted. It sat in a clearing surrounded by tall pine and fir trees. No other buildings were in sight. There was a small wooden shed to the left, and the ground was a mix of dry soil, pine needles, and wild underbrush. The cabin looked just like the photos. Gray-brown exterior, tin roof, old but sturdy. No power lines, no satellite dishes. I parked, stretched my legs, and stepped inside. The inside smelled like dry wood and old fabric. It was only one main room with a small kitchen area, a table, a chair, and a narrow cot with a thin mattress. The bathroom was a composting toilet in a separate shack about 20 yards behind the cabin. I unpacked most of my gear before the sun went down and heated up a can of chili on my small propane stove. I sat outside and ate while listening to the wind move through the trees. It was quiet, really quiet, and I liked it. For the first few days, I did what I came to do, rest. I slept late, sat outside in the mornings, read a little, and went for short hikes. The air was crisp, clean, and piney. I didn't hear a single car or plane the entire first week. I saw deer twice, couple squirrels. No people. I kept a hatchet by the door, mostly for chopping firewood, but something about having it nearby made me feel a little more secure. The first strange thing happened on day 8. That morning, I hiked farther than I usually did, about 2 hours deep into the forest before turning back. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something small but weird. My folding knife, which I always kept on the table near my cot, was gone. I searched everywhere, under the mattress, inside my backpack, even in the compost toilet shack. Nothing. I tried to tell myself I must have misplaced it or maybe brought it on the hike and dropped it. But I was always careful with that knife. It was a gift from my brother, and I never used it unless I was at the cabin. That night, I felt uneasy. I kept the hatchet even closer, right by the bed. I didn't sleep well. The next day, I stayed close to the cabin. Around noon, I went behind the cabin to use the toilet, and that's when I noticed footprints. Human ones, barefoot, no socks, no shoes. The ground was dry, but soft enough under the pines to capture prints clearly. There were about 4 or 5 prints leading from the edge of the tree line to the rear of the cabin, like someone had walked up to it and then walked away again. The prints weren't mine. I always wore boots, and my feet weren't that big. These were narrow and long. That shook me more than I want to admit. I hadn't seen a single person since I got there, and who walks barefoot in the woods like that? There were brambles, rocks, sharp pine cones. Even walking in thick socks would be uncomfortable. I followed the prints toward the woods until they disappeared into the underbrush, maybe 20 feet out. There wasn't enough of a trail to follow them beyond that. I kept the hatchet on me the rest of the day and locked the cabin door that night with both the latch and a long wooden dowel I jammed under the handle. I also blocked the front door with my backpack and cooler, just in case. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a noise outside, a light tapping, not knocking, just something lightly brushing against the wall, maybe on the backside near the toilet shack. I held my breath, sat up slowly, and listened. It came again like a stick or a finger lightly tapping the wood. Tap, 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 then silence. I didn't move. I just sat there with my back against the wall, hatchet in hand, waiting. After maybe 15 minutes, I finally heard crunching footsteps retreating into the woods. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, I walked around the cabin. There were more prints now, again barefoot, this time circling the cabin twice. Some came right up to the windows. I started to wonder if someone was living out here. Maybe a squatter or someone with a mental illness, or even just some backwoods hermit who didn't like people in his territory. Either way, I wasn't about to confront anyone. I just wanted to leave. I packed everything I could into the Escape, but when I turned the key, the engine didn't turn over. Dead. I tried again. Nothing. The battery hadn't been giving me problems before. I opened the hood and saw the wires. 2 of them had been cut clean through. Not chewed, not torn. Cut. Snipped with something sharp. I backed away from the car and stood there shaking. Someone had done this. I checked all around and saw no one. It was daylight, but the forest was so dense that someone could have been 20 feet away and I wouldn't have seen them. I wasn't panicked yet. Not really. I still had enough food and water to last a while. I had my emergency radio and solar charger. I decided I'd wait until morning, then hike the 7 or 8 miles back toward the nearest ranger station I passed on the way in. It'd be a long trek, but I'd done longer hikes before. I'd load my pack with essentials and head out at first light. That night, I barely slept. I stayed awake with the hatchet on my lap, a flashlight in my other hand. Around 2 a.m., I heard the tapping again, but this time it was louder, more deliberate. Something brushed against the wall outside, then tapped directly on the window near the kitchen. I didn't move. I didn't shine the light. I just sat there frozen. Then I heard what sounded like a long, slow drag of fingernails or something metal across the wood siding. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, then silence. I waited until daylight to go outside. There were scratch marks on the window, 3 of them, long, thin, and deep enough to gouge the outer glass. I followed the new prints into the woods a bit farther this time, maybe 50 feet. I found something I didn't expect. There was a small, crude shelter made of stacked branches and a tarp I hadn't seen before. Inside were a few dirty blankets, some animal bones, and a pile of items that made my stomach turn. A small pair of sunglasses, a child's shoe, and a rusty tin cup. Nearby was a plastic grocery bag with empty cans and a cracked hunting knife. This wasn't just some random camper. Someone had been living out here for a long time. I ran back to the cabin. I locked the door and started preparing for the hike. I only packed what I needed: my water, some energy bars, the radio, the flare gun, and the hatchet. I left a note inside the cabin just in case. I didn't care about the security deposit. I just wanted to make it out. I started hiking by 7 a.m. I kept to the old dirt road I'd driven in on. It twisted and turned, and I kept checking over my shoulder. About an hour in, I heard something behind me, twigs snapping. I stopped and looked. Nothing. I kept walking. 10 minutes later, I heard it again. This time it was closer. I turned and caught a glimpse. Just a shadow behind a tree, tall and still. Then it was gone. I started running. I don't know how far I got before I tripped. My foot hit a root, and I went down hard, slamming my knee and scraping my palms. I scrambled up and kept moving. I didn't look back again. I just ran until I could see the ranger station in the distance. When I finally got there, I was drenched in sweat, limping, and covered in dirt. The place was locked, but I found a service phone on the side of the building and called for help. A ranger showed up 20 minutes later. I told him everything, all of it. They sent a small team up to the cabin later that afternoon. They confirmed someone had been living in the woods nearby, but they didn't find anyone when they searched. The shelter I found was empty by the time they got there. The footprints matched the ones I saw earlier, and my name is Tyler Rollins. I'm 36 years old. In September 2017, I rented a remote cabin in northern Idaho to get away from everything. My job, my phone, the people who constantly needed things from me. I was burned out, sick of the noise, and desperate for a few weeks where I didn't have to answer a single email or pretend to care about anything. The cabin was about 2 hours from Sandpoint, deep in the Kniksu National Forest, near the Canadian border. I found it listed on an old wilderness travel site that barely had working links anymore. The owner was a retired forest ranger who had built it himself back in the 80s. It didn't have cell service or internet. Power came from a small generator and solar panel. Water was from a natural spring. It looked rustic and plain in the pictures, just how I wanted it. I booked it for 3 weeks. I told people I was going on a writing retreat and left it at that. My real plan was to sleep, walk around the woods, and not speak to a single soul until I felt like myself again. I arrived on a Sunday afternoon, driving a rented Subaru that I left parked off the gravel road about a quarter mile down the hill from the cabin. The trail up wasn't fit for cars, just a narrow path cleared through thick brush and spruce trees. The air was colder than I expected for September, about 50 degrees, and it smelled like pine needles and wet dirt. The cabin itself sat at the top of a small ridge, nestled between trees with no other structures in sight. It had one room, a small loft for sleeping, a porch, and an outhouse about 20 yards into the woods. Inside, it was warm and simple. Wooden walls, stone fireplace, cast iron stove, and shelves full of canned food, candles, and old books. There was no insulation, and you could feel the wind find its way through the boards, but it was quiet in a way I hadn't felt in years. The first 2 days were perfect. I read, hiked a little, made meals over the stove, and went to sleep with the sound of wind in the trees. I kept a little notebook of thoughts, but didn't write much. I didn't need to. Just being out there felt like healing. But the third night, I started to notice things. I woke up to a sound that I thought was part of a dream at first. A kind of soft dragging noise, like something being pulled through dry leaves. When I sat up in the loft, I didn't hear it again. I figured it was wind or a raccoon nosing around. Still, I grabbed the flashlight from the ladder and shined it out the window. Nothing, just black trees and silver moonlight. The next morning, I found strange marks in the dirt about 20 feet from the cabin. They weren't footprints exactly, but more like two shallow, parallel lines moving side by side, like someone had dragged sticks or tools across the ground. They started near the outhouse trail and curved back into the forest. I stared at them for a while, confused. It didn't look like an animal trail, and they weren't there the day before. I told myself it was nothing, just debris sliding in the wind or maybe something left behind by the cabin owner. I made breakfast and went on a short hike up the ridge. The forest felt heavier that day. Birds were quieter, and the wind moved through the trees in slow, cold bursts. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Not exactly fear, just that unsettled prickling on your skin when something feels off. That night, I lit a small fire in the fireplace and read until I got drowsy. I climbed up to the loft around 10. The night was colder, and I had to use 2 blankets. I was drifting off when I heard it again. That dragging sound, slow and deliberate. This time, it was louder and closer. I sat up, heart racing. The sound stopped. I waited, holding my breath, eyes locked on the window. The moonlight made shadows in the trees, but nothing moved. After a few minutes, I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was just a deer. I lay back down but didn't sleep for hours. The following morning, I found more marks. The same parallel lines, but now they were closer, 10 feet from the front porch. This time, there were small holes poked into the dirt next to them. For holes perfectly spaced like the feet of a table or stand. I knelt and touched them. The dirt was damp and freshly disturbed. Whatever made those marks had been there in the last few hours. I circled the cabin, scanning the trees. I didn't see anyone. No boot prints, no trash, no signs of a person. But I couldn't shake it. Someone had been out there. I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself not to leave. I'd waited months for this trip. I wasn't going to let some weird animal tracks or nerves ruin it. Still, I kept the hatchet closer that night and locked the door before bed. The next 3 nights were worse. The dragging sound came back, always just after midnight. Some nights it circled the cabin slowly. Other times it stopped right outside. Once I heard it scrape against the porch. But every time I looked outside, I saw nothing. Just black trees and my own breath fogging the glass. I started sleeping in short bursts, light and restless. I moved the hatchet next to my bed and kept the flashlight under the blanket. On the 5th night, I stayed awake, waiting to catch whoever or whatever it was. At 1:17 a.m., the sound came again. This time it was deliberate, like metal scraping over wood. I crept to the window and looked out. The moon was full and bright, and I saw something on the trail near the outhouse. It wasn't a person. It looked like a shape, tall, maybe 7 feet, covered in something white or reflective. It stood perfectly still, facing the cabin. Couldn't see a face. It was too far, but it didn't move, not even when I pressed my face to the glass. I stared for maybe 30 seconds, heart slamming in my chest, before I blinked, and it was gone. No sound, no motion, just vanished. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed my things. I didn't care how far from the car I was or how stupid I looked leaving early. I shoved everything into my pack and hiked fast down the trail. But when I reached the spot where I'd left the Subaru, my stomach dropped. The back window was shattered. Deep gouges ran along the driver's side door, like something had scraped metal across it. The back tire was slashed. I stood there for several minutes, shaking, trying to make sense of it. No animal did that. It wasn't random either. It was targeted. I ran back up the hill, nearly falling twice. I locked myself in the cabin and stayed inside all day, sitting near the fire with the hatchet in my lap. That night was the longest of my life. The dragging sound came again, louder, closer. Around 3 a.m., something knocked on the door. Not hard, just once. Then silence. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The knock didn't come again, but I heard slow footsteps circling the cabin until dawn. When the sun finally came up, I opened the door. On the porch was a small pile of rocks, stacked neatly. Next to it was a long, thin object I didn't recognize at first. Then I saw it was a rib bone, clean, white, and human-sized. That was it. I wasn't going to wait another night. I packed my things again, strapped on my gear, and left everything else behind. I carried the hatchet in my hand the entire hike down. I didn't care about the car. I just started walking along the gravel road until I found a ranger station nearly 8 miles away. They thought I was overreacting, said it was probably a bear or local prankster. They took my statement, called a tow truck for the car, and told me someone would check on the cabin later. I didn't wait around. I flew home the next day. That was almost 8 years ago. I haven't been back to Idaho. I tried to forget about it, but sometimes I wake up at night and swear I hear that dragging sound outside my window. I've moved twice since then, got security cameras, learned how to use firearms. 3 months ago, I got an email from an address I didn't recognize. No message, just an attached photo. It was the front of the same cabin. On the porch was another stack of rocks, and another rib. I don't know who sent it. I don't know what they want, but I changed my number, deleted the email, and bought blackout curtains the next day. I never wanted to believe someone had followed me. I still don't. But when I go to sleep at night, I think about that noise, that dragging sound. I don't believe in ghosts, but I believe in people, and some of them are worse. I've always been drawn to the idea of escaping the noise and chaos of city life. Maybe it's the constant buzz of traffic, the hum of the fluorescent lights at work, or the crowds in every direction. But when I found this cabin, tucked away in the woods. It seemed like the perfect place to finally get away from it all. I had been planning the trip for weeks. One of those trips you think about for so long that when it finally arrives, you're almost unsure if it's real. I rented the cabin from a small, family-run company that specializes in remote places. I didn't want to be anywhere near other people. The cabin was located about 2 hours outside of town, deep in the forest, with no neighbors for miles. It wasn't exactly isolated, but it was close enough that I felt the solitude I was looking for. I was 29 at the time, single, and a bit tired of the predictable routine I had grown accustomed to. I needed to recharge, to get away from the pressure of work and all the little things that pile up when you're constantly busy. The drive there had been peaceful, the kind of quiet road that winds and twists, leaving behind the suburban sprawl and moving deeper into the untouched woods. The trees stretched overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to reach across the road. I remember driving with the windows down, inhaling the fresh, earthy scent of pine. The cool air mixed with the scent of the rain from the night before, and for a moment, I felt a calmness that had been missing from my life for a long time. The cabin itself was nothing fancy. A small, 2-story wooden structure with a steep roof and a wide porch that wrapped around one side. The place had an old charm, the kind of rustic simplicity that made you feel like you were stepping back in time. It had been built in the 1920s and had the weathered look of a place that had endured the seasons for decades. I took my bags inside and settled in quickly. The interior was cozy, with dark wooden beams overhead and a stone fireplace at one end of the living room. The furniture was a mix of old and new, with plush armchairs and a sturdy wooden dining table. There was a small kitchen in the back with everything I needed: stove, fridge, and even an old-fashioned coffee maker. The first evening was peaceful. I spent a few hours sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the trees. There was no noise except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. I felt completely at ease, like the world was far away and I could finally breathe. But as the night wore on, something shifted. Started subtly at first, just a feeling of unease, like I wasn't alone. At first, I blamed it on the unfamiliar surroundings, the quiet that was so different from what I was used to. But the longer I stayed, the more I felt it. A presence. It wasn't anything I could point to, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I tried to dismiss it. The cabin was old, sure, but it wasn't haunted. I wasn't one to believe in ghosts or anything like that. But still, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that lingered in the back of my mind. I spent that night in front of the fire, reading a book and trying to ignore the strange sensations. But as the hours passed, the air in the cabin grew thick, almost suffocating. The fire crackled and popped, but the warmth didn't seem to reach me. It felt cold, like a dampness was settling into the walls. I stood up to stoke the fire, but before I could, I heard a sound, soft, almost imperceptible, like something scratching against the wood. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. The sound came again, this time louder, like nails dragging against the floor. I looked around the room. The air was still. Nothing seemed out of place. I told myself it was just the house settling, the old wooden beams creaking. But the scratching continued, coming from somewhere just outside the living room. With my pulse racing, I moved toward the door. I opened it just a crack, but there was nothing outside. The porch was empty, bathed in the light of the full moon. No wind, no animals, no signs of life at all. I shut the door and locked it, though I knew it wouldn't make a difference if something wanted to get in. That's when I heard it. A faint thump, like something heavy had fallen to the floor above me. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It felt deliberate, like something was moving in the shadows of the cabin. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just a couple of days to escape the grind of everyday life. My name's Kyle, I'm 32, and I've always been the type to enjoy the occasional solo retreat. It wasn't often, but when the chance arose, I took it. My wife, Mia, was all for it. We had a few kids, and sometimes she just wanted a break from the chaos. I wasn't the type to complain about it. In fact, I often welcomed the solitude. The cabin I rented was in the middle of nowhere, a small place in the mountains, not far from a town called Pine Ridge. I'd heard about it from an old friend who said it was perfect for getting away from everything. No cell service, no distractions, just nature, the smell of pine trees, and the sound of wind through the leaves. I rented it for 3 nights. I figured it would be enough to clear my head and maybe do a little hiking if I felt like it. I packed a couple of bags, grabbed some gear, and left for the drive alone. The kids were staying with Mia's parents for the weekend, so it was just me and the road. The drive to Pine Ridge was longer than I expected. The route took me through winding roads and dense forests. The weather was decent, not too hot, not too cold. It felt like the perfect time to be in the mountains. As I got closer, the road narrowed, and the trees grew thicker. I remember driving through a particularly long stretch of forest, where the canopy above blocked out most of the sunlight, leaving everything in a dusky, muted light. The GPS told me I was almost there, but something about the area felt off. It wasn't just the isolation, it was something deeper, a feeling that I couldn't quite shake. The thought passed quickly, and I attributed it to the long drive. The cabin was situated at the edge of a small clearing. It wasn't big, just a 2-story wooden building, aged but well-maintained. A small porch wrapped around the front, and there was a fire pit in the backyard. I could see the mountains in the distance, their peaks still dusted with the last remnants of snow from the winter. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I grabbed my bags and made my way inside. The cabin smelled of wood and old leather. It was cozy, with rustic furniture, a stone fireplace, and a large window at the back that looked out over the clearing. It was everything I expected and more, the kind of place where you could unplug and forget the world for a little while. I spent the first few hours getting settled. I unpacked, started a fire in the stove, and opened a bottle of wine. The place had a certain charm to it, something that made me feel at ease. I went outside to explore the grounds, making a quick loop around the cabin, checking out the surroundings. There were tall trees everywhere, but it was still open enough to feel like I wasn't completely cut off. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky when I decided to go for a short hike. I had brought some gear with me, a simple backpack, a water bottle, and a flashlight just in case. I didn't plan on going far, just enough to stretch my legs. The trail behind the cabin led into the forest, and I followed it without thinking much about it. First, the hike was relaxing. The air was fresh, and the ground was soft underfoot. The birds chirped overhead, and every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of a squirrel darting through the trees. The path wound its way up the mountain a bit, leading me higher and higher. I noticed a creek running alongside the trail, its water babbling over rocks. It was a peaceful sound, one that helped calm my mind. I must have been walking for about an hour when I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing I could really point to, but something about the forest felt different now. The light had changed too, the sun dipping lower and the shadows growing longer. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out here. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I paused for a moment, looking around. The trees seemed to close in on me, and the sounds of wildlife had quieted. Even the creek was quieter. I decided it was time to turn back. The hike hadn't been as enjoyable as I had hoped. There was a strange weight in the air, like the forest was watching me, or maybe waiting for something. I turned around and retraced my steps, but as I did, I felt like something was just a little off. The trail seemed different, not the same path I had come up. I tried not to panic. It was just the woods, right? Nature has a way of making you feel small. I kept walking, but with every step, it felt like I was getting further and further off track. The trees looked too similar. The path had become a maze, and I was starting to get disoriented. That's when I saw it. At the edge of my vision, something moved. It wasn't an animal, not the way a deer or a squirrel moves. It was too deliberate. My heart skipped a beat, and I stopped dead in my tracks. I looked around quickly, but all I could see were trees. The movement had been far off, maybe behind a cluster of thick trees to my left. I stood there, frozen, listening. I thought I heard a twig snap, then another. My pulse quickened, and I could feel the weight of the silence around me. I forced myself to breathe slowly, reminding myself that I was just overthinking things. But even as I tried to calm myself, the hairs on my neck stood up. Without wasting another moment, I turned and began walking faster. The trail was still confusing, but I focused on it with laser-like attention. My steps became more hurried, my breathing shallow. I didn't know what it was, but I was convinced now that someone was out there, watching me. Eventually, I saw the clearing ahead. The cabin was in sight. Relief washed over me, and I quickened my pace, pushing through the brush and rocks, not caring about anything but getting back. I reached the clearing and almost jogged the rest of the way to the cabin. I threw open the door, slammed it shut behind me, and locked it, my heart racing in my chest. I stood there for a moment trying to collect myself. I couldn't explain what had just happened, what I had felt out there, but I knew one thing for sure. I didn't want to go back out there. Not tonight, not ever. I spent the rest of the evening inside, making sure the doors and windows were locked tight. The fire in the stove crackled softly, and I drank the rest of the wine to calm my nerves. I thought about how silly I was being. The woods are full of strange noises. Animals, the wind, things I just wasn't used to. I'd get some rest and everything would feel normal again tomorrow. That night, I slept fitfully. Every creak of the cabin made me stir, and every rustle of leaves outside made my heart race. I kept hearing sounds in the distance, like footsteps crunching on the forest floor. But when I looked out the window, all I saw was the dark expanse of trees. There was no one there. By morning, the anxiety had settled, but the unease still lingered. I decided to spend the day inside. I kept the blinds shut, read a book, and made a small breakfast. The hours passed, but the forest outside seemed so still. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. It wasn't until the afternoon, just before I planned to head back home, that I found it. When I went to grab my things from the porch, I noticed something strange. The door to the shed, which had been locked when I arrived, was slightly ajar. My heart dropped into my stomach. I knew I had locked that door the night before. I approached cautiously, hand on the door handle. Slowly, I pushed it open. The shed was empty, except for a few old tools and some scattered debris. But there, in the corner, was a small pile of dirt. I could see fresh footprints leading into it. Someone had been there. Someone had been inside. I immediately bolted from the shed, locking the door behind me. My mind raced. I had to leave. It wasn't just my imagination. Someone had been watching me. Someone who knew this place better than I did. I grabbed my things, rushed to the car, and drove off without looking back. The road back to the town felt too long. The whole way, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting someone to be following me. I never went back to that cabin. I never thought I would end up in a situation like this. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a quiet weekend getaway, just to get away from the noise of the city. A simple escape to breathe fresh air, clear my head, and spend some time by myself in the mountains. But as I sat there, in the darkness, waiting for something that I couldn't quite explain, I realized that this weekend had become something else entirely. The cabin sat alone at the edge of a small, remote forest in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. It was a cozy, rustic place, far enough from town to be peaceful but close enough that I wouldn't feel too isolated. I had rented it from a small family-run company, which was well known for offering isolated cabins for those who needed a retreat. I had been up here before, a couple of years ago, with a few friends for a weekend of hiking and relaxing, but this time it was just me. I had taken time off work for this, hoping that the quiet would help me clear my head after months of stress and endless hours in front of a computer screen. I had arrived late in the afternoon, unpacked and settled in quickly. The cabin was small but comfortable, with a stone fireplace that added a rustic touch. It smelled of pine and wood, the kind of smell you associate with being deep in the forest. The evening came quickly, the sun dipping below the mountains, leaving behind a cool, crisp air that seemed to make everything sharper and clearer. I wasn't worried. I'd been in remote places before. The night was peaceful, and after a quick dinner of canned chili and some crackers, I sat by the fire, my thoughts drifting. The cabin was surrounded by tall trees, their branches swaying gently in the wind, and the occasional hoot of an owl or rustling of an animal in the distance. It was the kind of night that made you feel completely alone, peaceful but also a little unsettling. I had always been someone who enjoyed solitude, but something about this place felt different. There was an unease I couldn't quite shake, an itch at the back of my mind. Maybe it was the fact that the place was so isolated, or the fact that it was my first time here alone. Or maybe it was the sound of things moving just outside the cabin, the occasional twig snapping in the forest. By the time I decided to go to bed, the cabin was completely dark except for the flickering light of the fire. The wind outside was picking up, causing the trees to sway even more violently. I locked the front door behind me, just as a precaution, and made my way upstairs to the small bedroom. The bed was simple but comfortable. As I lay there, staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling, I tried to push away the feeling of unease that had started to settle in. It was just the isolation. I was overthinking things. I'd be fine, but as I drifted off to sleep, I heard something that made my eyes snap open. The faint sound of footsteps outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, the branches brushing against the cabin. But the footsteps were too distinct, too rhythmic. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy. I strained my ears, my heart starting to race. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or something else. But the more I listened, the more I started to question that. The sound was too close. It was as if someone was walking around the cabin, circling it. I pulled the covers over my head and tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just some wild animal. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. It was too deliberate. The footsteps continued, coming closer to the window. I could hear them crunching against the leaves and twigs. My chest tightened, and I slowly sat up, trying to see out the small window. But the darkness outside was impenetrable. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't about to go outside, but I also didn't want to be caught off guard. My mind raced with possibilities. Could be a neighbor or a hiker, maybe someone who had gotten lost. But the fact that they were circling the cabin made me uneasy. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but the footsteps eventually faded. Still, I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, listening, straining to hear any sound that might indicate someone was still out there. I kept the lamp on, and as the hours passed, I felt my exhaustion weigh on me. By the time the sun began to rise, I had barely slept at all. The next morning, I made myself breakfast, trying to push the previous night out of my mind. I went out onto the porch and looked around. There was no sign of anyone. No tracks, no broken branches. I had convinced myself that it had just been my imagination, the wind, or maybe an animal that I had mistaken for something else. But the more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. Why had I heard footsteps so clearly? Why had they been so deliberate? There was something off about the whole thing, and I couldn't ignore it. I decided to take a walk, to clear my head and get my bearings. The forest around the cabin was dense, but there was a small trail leading into it. I followed the trail, the morning sun filtering through the trees. As I walked, I tried to push the unsettling thoughts from my mind. The forest was quiet, peaceful, and beautiful, and I couldn't let a few strange noises ruin it. But as I walked deeper into the forest, I started to notice things that made me uneasy. The trees here were older, the ground softer, and the underbrush thicker. It was as if I was walking deeper into a place that hadn't been disturbed in years. The air felt heavier, and the further I went, the less I heard. There were no birds, no animals, nothing. I didn't know how long I'd been walking, but by the time I decided to turn back, the sun was already beginning to dip. The woods were dense, and the trail had become less obvious. I didn't panic, but I could feel the growing sense of isolation. I had wandered too far. The silence was suffocating. That's when I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. This time, they were louder and closer. I froze, my heart pounding. The sound wasn't from an animal. It was unmistakably human. Someone was walking toward me. I turned around, trying to spot the person, but the trees were too thick. My eyes scanned the darkness, but I saw nothing. The footsteps continued, coming closer. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to panic, but my mind raced with all sorts of thoughts. Was it someone looking for help? Or was it someone trying to find me? I began to walk quickly, my pace quickening to a near run. The footsteps followed, matching my speed. It was as if someone was right behind me, just out of sight. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, desperate to make it back to the cabin. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my legs were starting to feel weak. Finally, I broke through the trees, bursting out onto the small clearing where the cabin stood. I didn't stop running until I was inside, locking the door behind me. I sat down on the couch, shaking. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The footsteps had stopped once I reached the cabin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been following me. The rest of the night was a blur. I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. When morning came, I packed up my things and left. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I didn't want to sound crazy. I didn't want to even think about what might have been out there. I've never gone back to that cabin. I don't know what happened that night or who or what was out there, but something in the forest, something I couldn't explain, made me feel like I wasn't alone. And I've never forgotten the sound of those footsteps, still echoing in my mind. I've always liked the idea of getting away from the hustle and bustle of daily life. The constant noise, the endless calls, and the screen time, all of it started to feel suffocating. So, when the opportunity came up to spend a weekend in a cabin, isolated in the middle of the woods, I thought it would be the perfect escape. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat. It was the summer of 2023, and I was 32 years old. My name is Sam, and I had just finished a long stretch of work with barely any free time to myself. So, when my friend Emily mentioned the cabin her uncle owned, I jumped at the chance. Emily and I had known each other since college, and while she had visited the cabin a few times, I had never been there before. She mentioned that it was a bit secluded but assured me it would be relaxing. She couldn't have been more wrong. The cabin was located in a small, quiet part of the Appalachian Mountains, about a 4-hour drive from where I lived in Charlotte, North Carolina. I didn't mind the drive, as I was looking forward to the solitude, but as I got closer to the cabin, the landscape began to change. The road narrowed, twisting and turning through thick trees, and the air became cooler. The sound of birds and rustling leaves was the only thing that accompanied the car's tires as I made my way deeper into the forest. When I finally arrived, I took a moment to take in my surroundings. The cabin was a simple, 2-story structure made of dark wood, with a stone chimney curling smoke into the air, the kind of place you'd expect to see in an old wilderness story. The area around it was quiet, too quiet. No neighbors for miles, just dense trees and rugged land. It wasn't exactly unsettling, but it felt isolated. The kind of isolation that could make a person feel a little too alone. I parked my car by the cabin, grabbed my things, and headed inside. The air was crisp and fresh, a sharp contrast to the stale office air I had been suffocating in for weeks. The cabin was rustic but comfortable, with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a cozy loft above. There were a couple of old couches, and the floor creaked underfoot with every step. Everything felt worn, but in a way that made it feel homey. Emily wasn't there yet, so I decided to settle in and explore a bit. I wandered outside to the porch and looked around. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, the trees towering over everything. It was beautiful, but there was something unnerving about it. As I stood there, a strange sensation crept up my spine. I felt as if someone was watching me, but when I turned around, the area was empty. I shook it off, probably just my mind playing tricks on me. That evening, as the sun began to set, the cabin took on a different atmosphere. The light filtering through the trees became dimmer, and the sound of crickets started to fill the air. I made dinner and decided to sit outside on the porch to eat, enjoying the quiet. I had forgotten how calming it could be to be surrounded by nothing but nature. But as I ate, I started noticing something odd. The woods seemed to be Too still. No wind, no rustling of branches, nothing. It was eerily quiet. I couldn't even hear any animals. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The feeling of being watched returned, but this time, it was stronger. It felt like there was someone, something, just beyond the trees, hidden in the shadows, observing me. I glanced over my shoulder toward the woods, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. I finished eating quickly, gathered my things, and went inside. I locked the door behind me, something I rarely did when I was out in nature, but tonight, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I sat down in front of the fire, I felt more and more unsettled. The sound of the crackling logs in the fireplace was comforting, but it didn't drown out the sense of unease that settled in my gut. I grabbed my phone to check the time. Almost 9 p.m. Still no sign of Emily. I texted her, but got no reply. I tried calling, but it went straight to voicemail. I figured she was probably caught up with something on the way. I sat back in the armchair and let out a long breath. I knew I'd feel better once she got here, but as the hours dragged on, I began to worry. It was getting late, and there was still no word from her. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that she was probably just running behind. Still, a part of me was uneasy. The silence outside seemed to press in on me, and the temperature in the cabin dropped. I added another log to the fire, but the chill persisted. Around midnight, I decided to check outside for her. Maybe she had arrived and was just waiting outside or had gotten caught somewhere on the way up. As soon as I opened the door, I was hit with a blast of cold air. The night had gotten much colder, and the forest around the cabin was even more still than before. I called out Emily's name, but there was no response. I stepped off the porch and looked around. There was no sign of her car. The driveway was empty. The night was so dark, I could barely see more than a few feet ahead of me. The trees loomed like towering giants, casting long shadows across the ground. I called her again. Nothing. I started walking toward the edge of the clearing, where the trees grew thick and the shadows were deep. It was so quiet, I could hear my own breathing. Each step seemed to echo, and every snap of a twig beneath my feet made my heart skip. I felt like I was being pulled deeper into the woods, and that feeling of being watched came back in full force. My skin crawled, and I started to turn back toward the cabin when I heard something. A sound. Soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It was a rustling, faint at first, then louder, like something or someone was moving in the woods, just out of sight. I froze, listening carefully. The noise stopped. I waited, holding my breath. Then, there it was again, this time closer, just behind me. My heart raced as I turned around quickly, expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, only trees, stretching into the darkness. I called Emily's name again, but the woods didn't answer. The silence returned. I ran back to the cabin, locked the door behind me, and sat by the fire, my hands shaking. I couldn't explain what was happening, but every instinct in me told me to stay inside, away from the woods. I tried calling Emily once more, but still no answer. Panic set in, and I decided to wait it out. If she didn't show up by morning, I'd go looking for her. The hours dragged by. I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes, the sun was just beginning to rise. The room was bathed in pale light. My mind was foggy, and I felt disoriented. I glanced at my phone. Still no word from Emily. I couldn't wait any longer. I grabbed a flashlight and headed outside to search. This time, I wasn't going into the woods without a plan. I knew it was dangerous, but I had to find out what had happened. My breath fogged in the cold air as I walked toward the trees, trying to make sense of the situation. Something was off about this place. I could feel it in my bones. I called Emily's name again, louder this time. No answer. I ventured deeper into the forest, keeping the flashlight beam steady as I moved forward. The further I went, the less I could see of the cabin, swallowed up by the dense trees. The air grew colder, and the rustling from earlier began again, this time closer, louder. It was like something was moving just beyond my sight, staying just out of reach. And then I saw it. Emily's car. It was parked at the base of a narrow, overgrown trail leading further into the forest. But Emily wasn't anywhere around. My stomach sank as I approached the car, checking the interior. The keys were in the ignition. I stood there, confused and terrified, until I heard something behind me, a movement. I spun around, heart pounding, to find nothing. The feeling of being watched was unbearable now. I had to make a decision. Emily was gone, and something was wrong, horribly wrong. The woods weren't just still, they were waiting, and I was the next target. I turned back toward the cabin, retracing my steps. It felt like I was being pursued, as if something was following me just out of sight. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of the leaves, felt like a whisper urging me to keep moving. I made it back to the cabin, locked the door again, and sat in the corner, my eyes wide, watching the shadows. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. By late afternoon, I was preparing to leave. I couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. Something was in those woods, something that didn't want me to leave. It took every ounce of courage I had to get into my car and drive away. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced into the woods one last time. In that brief moment, I thought I saw something moving between the trees, something watching me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I never went back to that cabin. The first time I saw the cabin, I knew it wasn't going to be a simple weekend getaway. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat from the noise of everyday life, an escape from my chaotic job and the stress of the city. I had planned this trip for months, hoping for a break, a chance to clear my head. But I should have known better than to expect things to go smoothly. I had rented a small cabin tucked away in the Blue Ridge Mountains, somewhere in North Carolina. The kind of place people usually go to disconnect. The cabin looked nice enough in the pictures. A quaint little wooden structure with a porch overlooking a tranquil stream. Peaceful, isolated, just what I needed. I was 28, at the point in my life where I felt like I was constantly on the go. Work, bills, errands, it never seemed to end. So, I figured a weekend alone in the woods was the perfect remedy. I drove there alone, leaving behind the buzzing city and heading into the quiet hills. It wasn't easy to get there. The roads were narrow and winding, barely wide enough for two cars to pass each other. There were no signs for miles, just trees and the occasional animal crossing the road. It felt like the deeper I went, the more disconnected I became from the rest of the world. It was almost like the place was trying to keep itself hidden. A part of me enjoyed the isolation, until I realized how far removed from everything I truly was. When I finally arrived, the sun was starting to set. The cabin stood by itself, surrounded by tall trees. It was in a clearing, so you could see the bluish tint of the mountains in the distance. It was stunning, no doubt, but there was something unsettling about it. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was how silent everything was. Not even birds were singing, just the sound of wind rustling through the trees. I grabbed my bag and walked up to the front door, which creaked as I pushed it open. The cabin smelled like wood, old wood, mixed with something earthy, almost musty. Inside, it was just as I expected. A small living room with a fireplace, a kitchenette, a table with mismatched chairs, and a staircase leading upstairs. The walls were lined with bookshelves, most of the books covered in dust, as if no one had been here for a while. The only thing that stood out was a painting on the wall, a dark, stormy scene of the mountains. I didn't like it, but I figured it was just some local art. The place seemed perfect for the weekend. I unpacked my things, lit a fire in the fireplace, and made myself a cup of tea. I wanted to relax, forget about everything back home, and enjoy the solitude. As night fell, the wind picked up, howling through the trees outside. I pulled the blanket around myself and settled into the couch, watching the fire crackle and pop. But then the sounds started. First, it was just the wind. The trees groaned and swayed, and I assumed it was nothing more than the typical sounds of the forest. But after a while, I started hearing something else. A tapping. Soft at first, almost like someone knocking at the door. I paused, my body tensing. I waited for a few seconds, hoping it was just the wind. But it came again, louder this time. The sound was coming from somewhere outside, just beyond the cabin. I stood up, hesitant, and peeked through the window. Nothing, just darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was irrational, I knew that. There was nobody else out there. But the feeling clung to me, and I couldn't get rid of it. I closed the blinds and tried to relax, but the noise wouldn't stop. Tap, tap, tap. The wind howled again, and I could have sworn I heard something else. A faint rustling, like footsteps in the leaves. But when I checked, there was nothing. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe it was a squirrel or some animal scurrying around. I decided to ignore it and go to bed. But the tapping continued, steady and unrelenting. It kept me awake, gnawing at my nerves, until I finally fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up to a beautiful, clear day. The sun was shining, and the mountain air was crisp. I figured I'd gotten worked up over nothing, so I decided to take a walk around the area. The cabin was isolated, but it wasn't completely remote. There was a small trail that led down to the stream I had seen from the porch. I followed it, the sound of the water growing louder as I walked deeper into the woods. The trees were thick, casting long shadows on the ground, but the trail was well maintained. I passed a few fallen branches and rocks, but it didn't feel dangerous. I was just about to sit by the stream when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A figure, a man, standing just at the edge of the woods, watching me. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket that blended into the shadows of the trees. I froze. My first thought was to smile and wave, thinking maybe he was just another hiker. But something about him didn't feel right. His posture was too stiff, too unnatural, and he didn't wave back. He just stood there, staring. I quickly turned my back to him and hurried back to the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced with thoughts of who he could be. Was he a neighbor, a fellow traveler, or was there something else going on? When I got back to the cabin, I locked the door behind me and sat down. My nerves were on edge. I hadn't seen the man's face clearly, but the feeling he left in me was undeniable. It wasn't just the odd way he was standing. It was that he didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. I couldn't shake the thought that something was wrong. The tapping started again that evening. It was more intense this time, almost rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded like it was coming from all directions, as if someone or something was circling the cabin. I rushed to the windows, looking outside, but again, I saw nothing. I didn't know who to call. There was no cell service out here, and the nearest town was miles away. I felt utterly alone, trapped in this cabin, with no way to contact anyone. As the night wore on, the tapping grew louder. I didn't know if I was imagining things, but it felt as though the noise was closing in on me. Around midnight, I heard something else, something that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural sound, like an animal growling. I couldn't pinpoint where it came from, but it seemed to echo from the woods, growing louder with each passing moment. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my bag, threw on my jacket, and ran out the door. I didn't care where I was going, just as long as I wasn't inside that cabin anymore. The cold air hit me like a slap to the face as I sprinted down the trail, the sound of my footsteps mixing with the eerie growling in the distance. My mind raced. Was it a bear? A mountain lion? Or something else entirely? I ran for what felt like hours, never stopping, not daring to look back. The growling continued, but it never seemed to get any closer, just hanging in the air like a constant threat. Eventually, I came to a small clearing, and there, in the middle of it, was a cabin, another one. It was old, dilapidated, and hidden behind overgrown vines. There was no road leading to it, no trail that I could see, just a crumbling structure in the middle of nowhere. I knew it wasn't the cabin I had been staying in. This one was abandoned, forgotten by time, but I felt drawn to it, as if something about it was calling to me. With hesitation, I stepped inside. The air was musty, stale, like nobody had been there in years. Broken furniture lay scattered about, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. The only thing that stood out was a single chair in the center of the room, facing a wall with strange markings. My curiosity got the better of me and I approached it. As I reached out to touch the wall, a voice broke through my thoughts. "It's not safe," it said. I spun around, but no one was there. That was when I realized that I wasn't alone in the woods. It was the kind of weekend I had been looking forward to for months. My name is Sarah, and I was 28 years old, just a regular office worker living in a quiet town in upstate New York. My boyfriend, Mark, and I decided to rent a cabin in the woods for a long weekend to disconnect and relax. I wasn't one to be spooked easily, and Mark was more than happy to accommodate my desire for peace and quiet. We had heard great things about the place. A secluded cabin just outside a small, sleepy town. The cabin, which was named the Pineview Retreat, sat at the edge of a dense pine forest, miles away from any neighbors. The drive there was long but picturesque, with hills covered in dense greenery and winding roads that seemed to lead nowhere. I remember thinking how beautiful everything looked and how perfect it was going to be. When we arrived, the cabin stood quietly in the middle of the trees. It had a rustic charm to it: log walls, a stone fireplace, and large windows that looked out onto the forest. The whole place had been kept in great condition, and the view was exactly what we were looking for. As we unpacked the car, I felt a sense of peace. I could hear the rustling of the trees and the distant call of birds. Mark and I carried our things inside and got settled. The air was fresh, the temperature just right for fall, crisp with a slight chill. I was excited to start the weekend and explore the area. That first night, as the sun set and the stars appeared, we lit a fire in the hearth. The crackling wood was comforting, and we sat back in the worn leather chairs, sipping hot cocoa and talking about nothing in particular. It was just the kind of escape I needed. But as the hours passed, something in the back of my mind kept tugging at me. There was a strange stillness in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. Mark, always the practical one, didn't seem to notice anything odd, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Later that evening, when it was time to go to bed, the silence outside seemed even more pronounced. I couldn't hear a single animal, no owls hooting or wind rustling through the trees. I brushed it off as nothing. After all, I wasn't used to being this deep in the woods. The first night was uneventful. I slept soundly, with the occasional sound of the wind against the cabin walls. But the second day, something changed. We decided to hike through the woods to explore. It was a beautiful trail, with thick, towering pines and bright green moss on the forest floor. The air smelled earthy, like rain had recently passed through. We followed the trail for a few miles, then stopped to rest at a clearing with a small stream. It was peaceful, and for a moment, I felt completely at ease. However, as we sat there, something started to feel off. I couldn't explain it. It was subtle, like the air itself had thickened, becoming heavy. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced around the forest, half expecting someone to be watching us from behind a tree, but there was nothing there. Mark, noticing that I seemed distracted, suggested we head back to the cabin. I agreed without argument, and we made our way back along the trail. That night, the feeling of unease returned. Couldn't sleep. It wasn't that the cabin was uncomfortable. It was actually very cozy, but the air felt thick again. The silence was more oppressive this time. It was as if the entire forest had grown still, and it made me restless. I tried to dismiss it as nothing but my imagination. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something scraping against the side of the cabin. It was faint at first, barely audible, like nails dragging across wood. I lay there, listening, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. But it persisted. The sound grew louder, and it was coming from the back of the cabin. My heart began to race. I nudged Mark awake, but he just mumbled and turned over, not fully waking up. The scraping sound continued, followed by a dull thud. I couldn't stay in bed any longer. I slipped out from under the covers and grabbed the flashlight by the bedside table. I tiptoed to the back door and slowly peeked outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and the area around the cabin. But there was nothing there. No sign of movement, no animals, No wind, just the oppressive silence. I felt a rush of relief but couldn't shake the nagging feeling in my gut. I went back to bed and eventually fell asleep, but my dreams were filled with shadows, and I woke up several times throughout the night. The next morning, Mark and I had breakfast in the small kitchen, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to the night before. I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I kept it to myself. We decided to go for another hike, but this time, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were too quiet, unnaturally quiet. We walked along the trail, but I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling as though something was following us. After a few hours, we turned back. Mark suggested we take a detour and check out an old cabin that he had heard about from the locals when we arrived. I agreed, but when we reached the location, I didn't feel right. The place was decrepit, half-collapsed, and covered in vines. It looked abandoned for years. I didn't like the feeling of being there, but I didn't say anything to Mark. We explored the cabin briefly, but I couldn't shake the unease. The air felt thick again, and as we turned to leave, I saw something in the distance, a shadow moving between the trees. My heart skipped a beat, but when I blinked and looked again, it was gone. I turned to Mark, but he was already heading back to the trail. That night, things took a darker turn. We were sitting around the fire when I heard a knock on the door. A slow, deliberate knock. It sounded like someone was gently tapping at the wood, almost as though they were waiting for a response. My heart raced. Mark looked at me, confused, then shrugged and went to answer the door. When he opened it, there was no one there. Just the night, the dark, the trees. I couldn't explain it, but my nerves were shot. Mark, seeing how worked up I was, suggested we just go to bed and forget about it. I reluctantly agreed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As I lay in bed, I heard more knocks, soft at first, then louder, more urgent. And they were coming from all sides of the cabin now. It wasn't wind, it wasn't animals. These were knocks, deliberate and purposeful. I was too scared to get out of bed, too scared to even move. Mark was still asleep beside me, oblivious. The knocks continued for what felt like hours, and then nothing. Complete silence. No wind, no birds, nothing. I barely slept that night, the quiet suffocating. When morning finally came, I insisted we leave. I didn't want to stay another night in that cabin. Mark, still skeptical but sensing my distress, packed our things quickly. As we drove away, I couldn't help but look back at the cabin, the dark silhouette against the trees. It was behind us now, but I couldn't shake the sense of something being left behind, something that was still watching us. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend in the woods, just me and my old cabin tucked away on a secluded piece of land I had inherited from my aunt. The kind of place you drive to when you need to escape the chaos of life. No distractions, no noise, just peace. But as soon as I got there, things started to feel off. It was the middle of October, and the weather was perfect. Crisp, cool air greeted me as I unloaded my bags from the car, the scent of pine filling my lungs. I hadn't been back to the cabin in years, not since I was a kid. My aunt had always used it as a retreat from her hectic life. She had passed away a few months earlier, and I was the one who had to deal with the property. The cabin itself was simple. One room with a small kitchen, a wood stove, a single bed in the corner, and a tiny bathroom in the back. It wasn't much, but it was enough to escape to when the world felt too much. I spent the first couple of hours unpacking, making sure everything was in order. The cabin seemed fine. No leaks, no broken windows, and the furniture was still solid. It was a little dusty, but nothing I couldn't handle. After setting up, I decided to take a walk around the property. My aunt had always warned me to be careful in the woods, but I was familiar with the area. A small creek ran near the edge of the land, and the dense trees created a natural barrier that separated the cabin from the nearest neighbor, who was about a mile down the road. As I wandered along the creek, something caught my eye. Footprints, fresh ones, leading from the water's edge into the woods. I knelt down to inspect them, feeling a chill run down my spine. The tracks were deep, as though they belonged to someone heavy, and they were clearly recent. But no one should have been out here. The nearest town was miles away, and the cabin had been empty for months. I stood up slowly, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it. Could someone have been here before me? Had my aunt hired someone to maintain the place? I shook off the feeling of unease and continued my walk, deciding it was probably nothing. But as I got further from the cabin, I felt like I was being watched. The woods were quiet, too quiet, and every snap of a twig beneath my feet seemed to echo through the silence. I told myself I was being paranoid. I was alone, and I had been in these woods countless times before. I turned back toward the cabin, hoping to shake the nagging feeling, but as I reached the edge of the trees, something caught my attention again. There, on the porch, was a large bag, tied up neatly, as if someone had left it there for me. My heart skipped a beat. There was no way I had missed it earlier when I arrived, and there was no reason for anyone to leave a bag at the cabin. I stepped cautiously up to the porch, keeping my distance from the bag. I wasn't about to open it without knowing what was inside. Slowly, I reached down and nudged it with my foot. The bag shifted, revealing a small, weathered notebook. No name, no note, just a simple leather-bound journal, its pages worn and old. I picked it up, my fingers trembling as I flipped it open. The pages were filled with strange drawings, symbols I didn't recognize, and phrases written in a hurried scrawl. It looked like someone had been writing down their thoughts, but it didn't make sense. As I looked through the notebook, a strange sense of dread started to creep over me. The last page was filled with a single sentence, written over and over again, until it almost seemed like a chant. They are coming. They are always watching. I closed the book, my hands shaking. Who would leave something like this? And why? The air around me felt thick, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I didn't want to stick around to find out what that something was. I quickly took the notebook inside and locked the door behind me, sitting down at the small table in the cabin. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself that it was nothing, just some odd, misguided prank. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Night came quickly, and as the darkness settled in, the sounds of the forest grew louder. The wind began to pick up, and I could hear the branches creaking under the strain. I made a fire in the wood stove and tried to distract myself by reading, but the unease only grew. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump. Every gust of wind sounded like it was trying to get inside. At around midnight, I heard something outside, a soft rustling sound. It was faint, but enough to make me freeze. I stood up, straining to hear it again. There was definitely someone or something moving around outside. I couldn't tell if it was an animal or a person, but the way the sound circled the cabin made my blood run cold. Whoever it was seemed to be moving deliberately, taking their time. I grabbed the flashlight, my hand trembling as I went to the window and peered out into the dark. Nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, just beyond the reach of the light. I checked the doors and windows, making sure they were locked tight, and then sat down by the fire, trying to steady my breathing. The noises outside grew louder as the night went on. I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel near the porch, followed by the sound of something scraping against the walls. It sounded like fingers running along the wood, slow and deliberate. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat there, frozen, too scared to move. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noises themselves. My ears rang in the stillness, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Whatever had been out there was gone, but the air still felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. I didn't sleep that night, couldn't. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind, had me on edge. By morning, I was exhausted, but I knew I had to leave. Something wasn't right about that place anymore. I packed my things, feeling more and more paranoid with each passing minute. As I stepped outside, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. There was nothing to see, just the empty porch, the overgrown yard, and the woods stretching out into the distance. But as I turned to leave, I saw something in the dirt near the front steps. Footprints. The same deep, heavy prints I had seen by the creek earlier. And they were heading toward the cabin. I didn't waste any time. I jumped into my car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. The entire drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me the entire time. When I finally made it back to the city, I went straight to the police. I told them about the footprints, the strange bag, and the notebook. They didn't seem too concerned, but they promised to look into it. I never went back to the cabin. The woods are quiet now, but I can still feel that presence, as if it's waiting, just out of sight, watching. I hope I never find out who or what was out there. But one thing is for sure, I'm never going back. It was late September of 2014 when I decided to spend a long weekend up in the woods alone. I was 34 at the time, working long hours at a shipping warehouse in southern Ohio. The job paid well enough, but it wore me down. My back ached most days, and I'd gotten into the habit of popping 2 ibuprofen with my morning coffee. That fall, the weather was unusually dry, and I figured it would be my last chance to get away before winter started rolling in. I'd found a cabin listed on a local travel site. It was about 2.5 hours east, tucked into a thick stretch of forest near a place called Maple Creek. The pictures online showed a simple wooden cabin, small but clean. There was a little front porch, a chimney, and an old wood-burning stove inside. The place didn't have internet or cell service, and that was exactly what I wanted. Just some quiet, alone time. I packed enough food for 4 days, mostly canned soup, protein bars, coffee, and a few packs of instant oatmeal. I also brought my old .22 rifle, not because I planned on hunting, but because the idea of being completely alone in the woods without any protection made me uneasy. I'm not someone who scares easy, but being that far off the grid, you never know. The drive up was smooth. I left just after sunrise on a Thursday, and the early morning light made the woods look golden and peaceful. As I turned onto the gravel road that led to the cabin, the trees got thicker. Branches arched overhead like a tunnel. I had to slow down to a crawl to avoid scraping the sides of my truck. About a mile down the road, I finally saw the cabin. It looked just like the pictures, old but solid, sitting at the edge of a small clearing. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No birds, no wind, just silence. I figured maybe the animals were just hiding, or maybe I was overthinking it. I unloaded my gear, unlocked the door using the key from the lockbox, and stepped inside. The inside smelled like old wood and dust. There was a twin-sized bed in one corner, a small table, 2 chairs, and a cast-iron stove in the center of the room. A tiny kitchen area with a sink, an old propane-powered fridge, and a countertop completed the layout. That first day was uneventful. I unpacked, made a simple lunch, and sat outside on the porch for a while. The trees rustled gently in the breeze, and I remember thinking I hadn't felt that calm in a long time. As the sun set, I lit a small fire in the stove and heated up some soup. I brought a few books with me, and I read until I couldn't keep my eyes open. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Not because of noise, quite the opposite. The silence was so deep it started to feel loud. I kept listening for the sound of leaves moving, or a distant owl, or even a squirrel. But nothing, just dead, heavy silence. Around 2 a.m., I finally dozed off. The next morning, I made oatmeal and coffee and decided to explore the area around the cabin. There was a narrow trail that led deeper into the woods. I followed it for a while, maybe half a mile, until I came across a small stream. The water was clear and cold, and I sat there for a long time, tossing pebbles and watching the ripples. On my way back, I noticed something strange. There was a pile of rocks near the trail, neatly stacked like a marker or a cairn. It looked too deliberate to be random. I didn't remember seeing it on the way in, but I told myself I must have missed it. Later that afternoon, clouds rolled in. I chopped some wood from the pile out back and kept the stove going. As the wind picked up, I felt a chill settle into my bones. I kept busy reading and journaling, trying to ignore how off everything felt. I told myself it was just my mind adjusting to the isolation. That night, the wind howled around the cabin, and I thought I heard something moving outside. maybe a branch scraping against the wall. I checked through the window but didn't see anything. On the third day, I woke up to find boot prints in the dirt near the back of the cabin. They weren't mine. I could tell by the pattern. My boots had a specific tread, kind of like chevrons. These were smooth-soled, like old work boots. They led from the woods to the back window and then turned around. My stomach dropped. I hadn't heard anything during the night. I walked the perimeter of the cabin with the rifle in hand, looking for more signs, but the prints were the only clue. I stayed inside most of that day, keeping the rifle close. I double-checked the door locks and wedged a chair under the doorknob. Every time the wind made a noise, I flinched. I kept looking out the windows, half expecting someone to be standing at the edge of the clearing. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Around midnight, I heard a thud on the front porch. I froze. The stove was out and the room had gone cold. I grabbed the rifle and crept toward the window. The porch was empty, but I saw something strange at the base of the steps. A small pile of sticks, arranged in a circle. I didn't sleep at all after that. I sat in the chair with my back to the wall, watching the door until the sun came up. The next morning, I made the decision to leave. I didn't care that I had one more night booked. I quickly packed my things, kept the rifle slung over my shoulder, and locked up behind me. When I got to my truck, I found more boot prints near the driver's side door. They hadn't been there before. I drove away as fast as I could. Once I got back to the main road, my phone buzzed with missed texts and emails. I didn't answer any of them until I got home. Back at my apartment, I took a long shower and tried to shake the feeling. For days afterward, I kept looking out the windows, half expecting someone to be watching me. I filed a report with the local sheriff's office, just in case, but I never heard back. They probably thought I was overreacting. Maybe I was, but I've never been back to that area. Over time, I stopped thinking about it so much. Life got busy again. Work, errands, bills. But sometimes, when it's late and the house is quiet, I think about those prints. Whoever left them didn't try to break in. They didn't leave a message, but they wanted me to know they were there. That's what still gets to me. It wasn't some wild animal and it wasn't a ghost. It was a person, out there in the woods, watching, waiting, getting closer each night. I haven't gone camping alone since. It was the spring of 2017 when I decided to get away from everything for a while. I was living in Indianapolis back then, working a stressful office job that kept me glued to a desk for most of the day. My sleep was terrible, my back constantly ached, and my eyes burned from staring at a screen for hours. I felt like I was slowly losing touch with myself. So when my cousin Josh mentioned he had a small, old cabin up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that no one had used in years, I jumped at the opportunity. He said I could use it for as long as I wanted, just to get away. I didn't ask questions. I just packed my truck and left that same weekend. The cabin was about 6 hours north, tucked away in the woods near a place called Bruce Crossing. It was old, like 1950s old, built by my cousin's grandfather. Josh had used it a few times in college, but said he hadn't been up there in almost 10 years. It didn't have running water or electricity, but there was an outhouse, a wood-burning stove, and a small stream about 50 yards out for water. That was enough for me. I arrived late in the afternoon, after a long, quiet drive. Once I got off the main highway, it was nothing but dirt roads and tall pine trees. I barely saw any other cars. The gravel crackled under my tires as I followed the directions Josh gave me. Eventually, I found the narrow turnoff hidden behind some brush. It looked more like a walking trail than a road, but I followed it anyway. After about half a mile, the cabin finally came into view. It was small and square, with faded red paint peeling off the wooden siding. A rusted metal chimney poked out of the roof, and there was a short porch with a broken step. A few old chairs were stacked against the wall, covered in cobwebs. The windows were grimy but intact. I parked beside it, stretched my legs, and just stood there for a moment, taking it all in. There wasn't a single sound except the wind in the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. It was peaceful in a way that made me feel like I could finally breathe again. I spent the first few hours cleaning. There was dust on everything, and a thick layer of pine needles covered the porch and roof. Inside, the air smelled stale but not moldy, just untouched. The furniture was old but sturdy. There was a twin bed in the back corner with a thin mattress, a little wooden table, and 2 chairs. Shelves lined the walls, mostly empty except for some old canned food that I didn't trust. I swept the floor, wiped down the surfaces, and aired it out as best I could. By nightfall, I had a fire going in the stove and was stretched out on the bed, wrapped in a sleeping bag with a lantern flickering beside me. I felt like I had finally escaped. The first 2 days were uneventful. I spent most of my time walking the trails around the area, reading books I hadn't touched in years, and just sitting on the porch doing nothing. I cooked simple meals over a small propane burner I brought with me and used the nearby stream to wash up. There was no cell service, which at first made me anxious, but by the end of the second day, I felt disconnected in a good way, like the world had finally stopped spinning so fast. It was the third night when things started to feel off. It had rained that afternoon, a steady drizzle that turned the dirt path into mud. I had stayed inside most of the evening, reading by lantern light. Around 10, I crawled into bed and listened to the sound of the rain tapping on the metal roof. It was soothing, but sometime around midnight, I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why. There hadn't been a noise exactly, but something felt different. The kind of feeling you get when someone is staring at you from across a room. I stayed still, listening. The rain had stopped. Everything was dead quiet. No wind, no crickets, just nothing. I sat up slowly, reached for the lantern, and turned it up a notch. The dim light filled the cabin, flickering against the walls. I didn't see anything unusual. The door was still bolted, the windows closed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was outside. I got out of bed and went to the door. I opened it slowly and stepped onto the porch. The air was damp and cold. Mist hung low over the ground, and the forest looked darker than usual. I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no animals, nothing. But the hairs on my neck were standing up. I felt watched. I waited a few minutes, then went back inside and locked the door. I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, I found something strange. There were boot prints in the mud outside the cabin. Not mine. These were bigger and deeper, like someone had been standing out there for a long time. They came from the woods, stopped near the porch, then turned and disappeared back into the trees. I stared at them for a long time, my stomach twisted. I hadn't heard anything. Who the hell had been out here? There were no other cabins nearby, no campgrounds, nothing. Just woods. I spent the day on edge. I kept checking over my shoulder, listening for twigs snapping or leaves rustling. I even took my hunting knife with me when I went to the stream. Every sound made me jump. I didn't see anyone, though. No movement in the trees. No other tracks. Just those same boot prints drying in the sun. That night, I locked the door, closed the shutters, and kept the lantern burning low beside me. I woke up again around midnight. This time I knew why. I heard a sound outside. It was faint, like a footstep or maybe something brushing against the wall. I sat up, holding my breath. Then I heard it again. A soft scrape against the wooden siding. I grabbed the lantern and my knife and crept to the door. I didn't open it, just listened. My heart was pounding. Then came a knock. 3 slow, heavy knocks on the door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stood there, frozen. Another knock. Same rhythm. Slow and deliberate. I wanted to call out, to yell, to ask who was there, but something told me not to. Whoever was out there wasn't lost or friendly. They had been watching, standing in the rain, leaving prints. Now they were knocking in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere. I stood like that for what felt like forever. No more knocks came. Eventually, I backed away from the door, still holding the knife. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning finally came, I opened the door. There were more boot prints on the porch. Fresh ones, mud tracked across the boards. I followed them with my eyes as they led off into the woods again. Same direction as before. I felt sick. I should have left right then, but I didn't. I kept telling myself it could have been a hunter or some random person. Maybe they thought the cabin was abandoned. Maybe they meant no harm. I tried to convince myself of that, but deep down I knew better. The next few days were tense. I barely left the cabin. I started stacking wood and heavy objects against the door at night. I kept the knife on me at all times. I even built a crude alarm system with some tin cans and string across the porch, hoping to hear something if someone came close. Every little noise made me jump. I didn't sleep much. The sense of being watched never went away. On the 6th day, I saw him. It was late afternoon. I had finally gathered enough courage to go to the stream and fill up my water containers. I was kneeling by the water, filling a jug, when I felt something. That same feeling I had before. I looked up and scanned the woods. About 50 yards away, partially hidden behind a tree, was a man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat and a hood. I couldn't see his face. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me. I stood up slowly, keeping my eyes on him. He didn't move. I picked up my water jug and started backing away. He stayed where he was. I turned and walked quickly back to the cabin, trying not to run. I didn't look back. When I got inside, I locked everything and sat in the corner with my knife in hand. My breath was shallow. My mind was racing. I knew it was him, the one who had been knocking, watching, standing in the rain. Now I had seen him and he knew I had. That night was the longest of my life. I didn't sleep at all. Every hour I checked the windows. I kept the lantern burning until it almost ran out. I didn't hear anything, but I knew he was out there, waiting. The next morning, I packed everything. I threw my gear into the truck and didn't even bother organizing it. I just wanted out. The mud had dried enough for me to drive. I didn't eat, didn't clean up. I just left. As I drove down the trail, I kept checking the rearview mirror. I didn't see him again, but I felt like he was watching me go. When I hit the highway, I finally breathed again. I didn't stop until I was back in Indianapolis. I stayed with my brother for a few days before going back to my apartment. I didn't tell many people what happened. I didn't want to explain it. I just told them I cut the trip short. It's been years now, and I still think about that cabin. About the man in the woods. I don't know who he was or what he wanted. I don't know how long he had been watching me. Maybe he lived out there. Maybe he just waited for people to show up. I never reported it. What would I even say? I never went back, and I never will. The cabin is probably still there. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to spend a week alone at an old cabin deep in the woods of northern Maine. I was 34 at the time, divorced and trying to sort out my life. My job had given me some time off, and I thought some solitude might help me clear my head. I had found the cabin through a private rental ad online. It was cheap, isolated, and had no cell signal, which was exactly what I was looking for. I brought enough food and supplies for the week, loaded everything into my old Subaru, and drove 6 hours north from where I lived in Massachusetts. The roads got narrower and rougher the farther I went. The last hour was nothing but gravel paths through thick pine forests. The directions the owner gave were vague, but after turning at a rusted metal gate and following a barely visible trail, I finally saw the cabin. It looked like it hadn't been used in a while. The wood was weathered, and moss was growing on parts of the roof. Still, it stood solid and had a small porch that overlooked a quiet lake. It was beautiful in a very raw, untouched kind of way. I spent the first day settling in. I checked the pantry, unpacked my food, started a fire in the small wood stove, and swept out the corners for cobwebs. The cabin had one main room with a bed, table, and kitchenette, plus a tiny bathroom in the back with a compost toilet. There was no electricity, but the owner had left some solar lanterns and candles. The silence was overwhelming at first. No cars, no people, no background noise. Just the wind in the trees and the occasional splash of fish in the lake. The first couple of days were peaceful. I read, cooked simple meals, went on long hikes, and slept better than I had in years. I didn't see another person, not even a passing boat on the lake. It was exactly the kind of escape I had hoped for. But then, on the third night, something shifted. It started with a faint knocking sound that woke me up. It wasn't loud, just soft taps, like someone gently rapping their knuckles against the outside wall. I lay still in bed, heart pounding, listening. The knocking stopped, and I tried to convince myself it was just a branch or an animal. I eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, looking for any sign of what could have made the noise. There were no tracks in the dirt. I let it go and tried to enjoy the day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I locked the door and bolted it from the inside, even though I hadn't the first 2 nights. Around midnight, I woke again. This time it wasn't knocking. It was the sound of dry leaves crunching under slow, deliberate steps just outside the cabin. I held my breath. The footsteps moved from one side of the cabin to the other, then stopped. There were no voices, no lights, nothing. I stayed awake for hours, ears straining in the dark, but the sounds didn't come back. In the morning, I found a single footprint in the damp dirt near the corner of the cabin. It was large, maybe a size 12 or 13 boot. Definitely not mine. The tread looked fresh, and it was pointed toward the wall as if someone had been standing there, facing the cabin. That footprint changed everything. I was no longer dealing with paranoia. Someone had been there. I debated leaving, but the thought of driving those long gravel roads at night didn't sit well with me either. I convinced myself it could have been a hunter or hiker passing through, even though I knew how remote this place was. I kept a hatchet next to the bed that night. On the 5th day, I went out for a short hike, not too far from the cabin, and when I came back, I noticed the door was slightly open. I was sure I had locked it. Inside, everything looked untouched at first, but then I saw that one of the kitchen drawers was halfway open. I never left it that way. I also noticed that one of the solar lanterns was missing from the table. My backpack, which I kept hanging on a hook by the door, was on the floor. It wasn't torn or emptied, just moved. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in a chair facing the door with the hatchet in my lap. I kept the lantern on, its dim light casting long shadows. Every time I heard a creak or rustle, my whole body tensed. Sometime after 3 a.m., I saw movement on the porch through the small window. A figure, tall and thin, just standing there. I couldn't see a face, just the outline. I didn't move, didn't breathe. After a few minutes, the figure walked away into the woods. I waited until daylight, then packed my things. I didn't bother with breakfast. I threw everything into the car and drove out of there faster than I probably should have. The drive back felt like crawling out of a nightmare. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I expected to see something chasing me. When I got home, I reported the incident to the local sheriff's department in that county. They told me they'd send someone to check the area, but they didn't seem surprised or concerned. Maybe this kind of thing wasn't uncommon out there. I didn't get any follow-up. Months later, I looked up the property online again, and the listing was gone. The owner never responded to my messages. I still don't know who was out there with me or why, but I know they were watching me. Maybe the cabin had been used by someone else. Maybe I had wandered into a place someone considered theirs. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still love nature, still go on hikes, but never without someone else. I also make sure there's cell service, and I never stay somewhere I can't leave quickly. Looking back, I think the scariest part wasn't seeing the figure. It was the slow buildup, the little things that didn't add up. The noises, the moved items, the open drawer. Whoever was out there never tried to hurt me directly. They just wanted me to know they were there. They were patient, quiet, close, and that's what haunts me. Not ghosts, not monsters. Just the simple fact that someone was out there watching me every night from the trees. I was 34 when it happened. It was early October of 2017. I had just come out of a long, exhausting divorce that dragged on for almost 2 years. I was mentally drained and tired of the city noise in Louisville. I needed a break, somewhere quiet, far from traffic, work emails, and people. I remembered an old coworker once telling me about a remote cabin he stayed in, out in the woods near Jefferson National Forest in Virginia. He said there was no cell signal, no internet, and barely a road to get there. That sounded perfect. I found the listing online after digging around a bit. It was owned by some older man who rented it out occasionally, mostly to hunters or hikers who knew the area. The pictures showed a small, single-story wooden cabin surrounded by trees. No nearby neighbors, just forest in all directions. There was a fireplace, a small kitchen, a bedroom with a cot and mattress, and a wraparound porch. It looked exactly like what I needed. I booked it for 2 weeks. I packed up a cooler, some dry food, water jugs, a couple of books, a flashlight, batteries, and other basic gear. I left behind my phone and laptop intentionally. The drive was about 7 hours. The last hour was on winding, narrow dirt roads that were barely maintained. My old Subaru handled it fine, though I felt a little nervous about getting stuck or having a breakdown that far out. But once I saw the cabin tucked between the trees, those worries faded. It looked peaceful. The first few days were uneventful in the best way. I read on the porch, drank coffee in the mornings, and listened to the wind in the trees. The air was crisp with that early fall chill. I built small fires in the fireplace at night and slept better than I had in months. I didn't see another person or hear a car the entire time. No power lines, no buzz of technology. Just nature. There was an old hiking trail about half a mile from the cabin, and I followed it a few times. It twisted through dense woods and overgrown thickets, but eventually led to a small creek. I sat by it for hours one afternoon, just listening to the water. By the 5th day, I started to get more comfortable with the isolation. I stopped jumping at little sounds and started exploring a bit more. I noticed some rusted beer cans and old trash near the trail, maybe from past campers or hunters. Nothing alarming. The only weird thing I saw was a half-buried rubber boot off to the side of the trail. It was old and brittle, probably there for years. I didn't touch it. One evening, I decided to walk the trail right before sunset. I figured I had enough time to reach the creek and get back before dark. I didn't bring a flashlight, which was a mistake. The woods got darker much faster than I expected, and the sky clouded over. I never made it to the creek. I turned back halfway and started walking fast. I lost the trail briefly, just for a few minutes. It was enough to throw off my sense of direction. Every tree looked the same. I tried to retrace my steps, but the fading light made it tough. I kept moving, trying to stay calm. After about 20 minutes, I saw a shape through the trees that looked like the roof of the cabin. Relief hit me hard. I got back just as full darkness settled in. That night, I stayed up late, thinking about how easy it would be to get lost for good out there. The next morning, I noticed something strange. The front porch had muddy scuff marks, like someone walked up to the door with wet boots. I hadn't worn mine since the hike the day before, and I always knocked the dirt off before coming inside. The prints were fresh. It had rained a little overnight, and the mud was still damp. I looked around the area but didn't see anyone. No tire tracks on the dirt path, no signs of recent activity. I told myself it could have been a deer or bear brushing against the step, maybe knocking some mud loose. I tried not to overthink it. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing noises outside. It wasn't animals scurrying or tree branches. It sounded like footsteps on dry leaves, circling the cabin. I sat up and listened for a long time. Every time I thought it stopped, it would start again, faint and slow. I didn't have any weapons, just a heavy flashlight. I gripped it tight and waited until morning. When the sun came up, I opened the front door. No one was there, but the porch had more muddy marks, this time on the side facing the woods. I walked a few yards into the trees, looking for prints or clues. I saw broken twigs and disturbed leaves, like someone had walked through. It led into the trees but faded fast. The ground was too dry for clear tracks. I felt uneasy but didn't want to panic. I told myself it was probably a hunter or hiker passing through. Maybe they got curious about the cabin. But why come at night? That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I kept the door locked and moved the cooler and a chair in front of it when I went to bed. Felt paranoid, but I couldn't relax. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to a loud crack outside. Something heavy stepped on a branch. I stayed still, listening. More footsteps, then silence. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I walked the area more carefully. I found something I hadn't seen before. About 50 yards behind the cabin was a tree with odd markings on the bark. Long vertical scrapes, about shoulder height. Some looked fresh, others older. Could have been a bear or someone using a knife. But there was something deliberate about the pattern. Too even, too straight. Near the base of the tree, I found a small pile of rocks stacked carefully, like a marker. That changed everything. Animals don't stack rocks. I was sure now someone was out there. I didn't feel safe staying the full 2 weeks. I decided I'd leave the next morning. I packed up most of my gear that night and kept my boots on as I slept. Around 3 a.m., I heard a noise that made my blood go cold. A sharp knock on the front door. Just one. Then silence. I waited, barely breathing. Nothing else happened. I stayed awake until the sky started to lighten. I opened the door slowly, holding the flashlight like a weapon. No one was there. But this time on the porch was something new. A small bundle of sticks tied together with twine. It looked handmade, like a charm or warning. I left it untouched. I loaded my stuff into the car in minutes. I didn't bother checking the trail or walking around again. I started the engine and drove out fast, bouncing over the rough road, barely slowing for the curves. It wasn't until I hit pavement an hour later that I felt safe again. I never reported it. I didn't know what to say. Nothing technically happened. I wasn't attacked or robbed. But someone was out there and they wanted me to know it. Maybe they lived off-grid. Maybe they didn't like people on their land. Maybe they were just messing with me. Whatever the reason, they succeeded in scaring me off. Back home, I tried to forget about it. I didn't tell anyone for a long time. Eventually, I looked up the area out of curiosity. I didn't find anything alarming. No recent crimes or missing people. But there were a few old posts on forums from hunters who mentioned hearing strange noises near the same part of the forest. One even said he found a dead deer hanging from a tree in a way that didn't look natural. I haven't been camping alone since. I still love the woods, but I keep to more public places now. The memory of those nights, the footsteps, the knocks, and that bundle of sticks still creeps up when I'm alone. I know there was someone out there, and I know they knew I was there too.